Listen close, because this is where empires crack wide open. Lady Seris Vaelor, nobility draped in velvet and lies, carried a secret that could burn her house to ash. Pregnant. Forbidden. The father? Alpha King Vaeren Draxir, the iron ruler her bloodline was bred to hate. What happens when the woman who mastered silence can no longer hide the truth her body's screaming? When love becomes the most dangerous weapon in a world built on inherited war? Stick with me till the end of this story. You're going to need it. Drop a like and comment your city below so I know my people are paying attention. This gets darker before it gets light. The stormlight bled purple across the obsidian spires of Valtheris Palace the night Seris realized her body had become a battlefield she could no longer control. So, she stood alone in her private chambers, hands pressed flat against the carved mirror that had witnessed every careful deception of her 23 years. The reflection staring back wore the practiced composure of nobility, shoulders straight, jaw set, eyes empty of everything except determination. But beneath the layered midnight silk and silver-threaded corset, her body had begun whispering truths she wasn't ready to speak aloud. 3 months gone, maybe 4. The numbers felt like prison bars closing around her throat. She'd missed 2 bleedings, then 3. Her handmaidens had started watching her with questions they were too terrified to ask. Yesterday, the head seamstress had suggested letting out the waistline of her ceremonial gowns, her voice carefully neutral, her eyes screaming suspicion. Seris had smiled, thanked her, ordered the alterations. Then she'd returned to her chambers and vomited until her ribs ached. This was how power died in the Empire. Not with swords or fire or grand theatrical collapse. It died in silent rooms where women's bodies became evidence of crimes no crown could pardon. The father wasn't just scandalous, he was impossible. Alpha King Vaeren Draxir, supreme ruler of the Draxir Dominion, commander of border wars that had devoured entire provinces. The Iron Sovereign whose name her house had weaponized as a curse for 3 generations. Their families had fed on rivalry like wolves on winter meat. Entire villages had burned beneath banners stitched with inherited hatred. Children learned to spit at the mention of enemy houses before they learned mathematics or music. The Vaelors and the Draxirs weren't just political opponents. They were blood mythology. Yet 4 months ago, inside a forgotten observatory during a diplomatic summit designed to fail, Seris and Vaeren had spoken not as enemies, but as 2 exhausted heirs drowning beneath the weight of legacy they'd never chosen. Rain had hammered the glass dome above them, while inside, separated from the theater of false smiles and poisoned wine, they'd talked about philosophy, about governance, about the suffocating performance of power that turned rulers into hollow monuments long before death claimed them. What began as intellectual defiance had become dangerous honesty. Honesty had become touch. Touch had become the kind of reckless intimacy that felt like freedom and tasted like treason. Now freedom had become consequence. Seris pressed her palm against her abdomen, feeling nothing yet except the terrible certainty of what was growing there. A child. Half Vaelor, half Draxir, the living embodiment of a peace treaty written in flesh and blood that would destroy both houses the moment its existence became known. She'd considered ending it. The thought had arrived cold and clinical in the darkest hours of night when survival instinct overpowered sentiment. There were herbs, procedures, women who operated in shadows and asked no questions if the payment was sufficient. But every time she moved toward action, something stopped her. Not sentiment, not love. Something harder. The realization that she was so goddamn tired of letting fear make her decisions. A sharp knock fractured her spiral of thought. Seris straightened, wiped her eyes, and transformed her face into the mask of casual indifference that had kept her alive in a palace where vulnerability was blood and water, and predators circled constantly. The door opened. Mira, her closest handmaiden, and the only person in Valtheris who'd earned anything resembling trust, slipped inside. The woman's face carried the kind of controlled panic that preceded disaster. Seris felt her stomach drop. "Your guardian requests your presence in the eastern parlor," Mira said quietly. "Lord Malrek. He's brought the physicians." The words hit like a fist to the solar plexus. Seris forced herself to breathe, to think, to calculate. Malrek Vaelor, her uncle, her guardian, the political architect who'd orchestrated House Vaelor's survival through 6 coups and 4 assassination attempts. A man who worshipped reputation with religious intensity and believed bloodline purity justified any cruelty. If he'd summoned physicians he already knew, or suspected enough that the difference no longer mattered. "Tell him I'll be down shortly," Seris said. Her voice came out steady. A small victory. Mira hesitated. "My lady, if you need, I'll be fine." The lie sat heavy between them. Mira nodded once and disappeared. Seris stood alone in the sudden silence, her reflection staring back with eyes that finally looked as terrified as she felt. She'd always known this moment would come. She'd just hoped she'd have more time to decide whether she'd face it with defiance or surrender. The eastern parlor smelled of imported tobacco and old leather, the kind of calculated masculine atmosphere designed to make women feel like intruders in their own homes. Lord Malrek Vaelor sat behind the mahogany desk that had belonged to Seris's father before a rival house had arranged his convenient death. At 62, Malrek wore power the way other men wore skin. Natural, unquestioned, absolute. His silver hair was pulled back in the military style. His eyes were pale gray and sharp enough to dissect souls. Two physicians stood flanking him like ceremonial guards. Seris entered with her chin up and her hands relaxed at her sides. Every instinct screamed across her arms over her abdomen. She forced herself still. "Uncle," she said. Her voice carried just enough warmth to suggest affection without committing to actual emotion. "You summoned me." Malrek studied her with the clinical precision of a man evaluating livestock. "Sit." It wasn't a request. Seris sat, the silence stretched. A negotiation tactic she'd watched him deploy 1,000 times. Let the other person's discomfort fill the space. Wait for them to speak first. Capture confession through patience. She'd learned from the best. She stayed quiet. Malrek's mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost respect. "You've been avoiding court," he said finally. "Missing the seasonal observations. Declining invitations to the council chambers. Your seamstress reported concerning alterations to your wardrobe." Seris met his eyes without flinching. "I've been unwell. Fatigue. Nothing worth troubling the house physicians over." Malrek leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked. "Curious," he said softly, "because the symptoms you describe sound remarkably similar to early pregnancy." The words landed like thrown knives. Seris felt her pulse spike, but kept her expression neutral. "That's a significant accusation, Uncle. It's an observation, one I'd prefer to confirm or disprove before rumors do the work for us." He gestured to the physicians. "Dr. Corwin has served House Vaelor for 30 years. His discretion is absolute. I'm asking you, as head of this house, to submit to examination. Now." The trap closed. If she refused, she confirmed guilt through evasion. If she agreed, the truth would be documented, witnessed, and weaponized. Seris calculated her options in the span of 3 heartbeats. Then she stood. "No." The single syllable dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Malrek's expression didn't change, but something cold shifted behind his eyes. "That wasn't a request, Seris. I'm aware. My answer remains unchanged." She turned toward the door. Malrek's voice followed her like a blade. "If you walk out of this room, I will interpret your refusal as confirmation. I will act accordingly. Do you understand what that means?" Seris stopped. Didn't turn around. "It means you'll do what you've always done, Uncle. Treat people like strategic assets on a board. Sacrifice whatever threatens the house's reputation. Call it loyalty. Call it survival. Call it whatever helps you sleep." She looked back over her shoulder. "But you won't call it what it actually is." "Fear." Malrek rose slowly. His voice dropped to the register he used before ordering executions. "Who is the father?" Not a question. A demand. Seris smiled. The expression felt like glass against her face. "That's my business. Everything that threatens this house is my business. You will answer me." "Or what? You'll lock me away? Arrange an accident? Force me into some distant sanctuary where the problem disappears quietly?" Malrek's jaw tightened. "If necessary." The admission hung between them, brutal and honest. Seris felt something crack inside her chest. Not surprise. Worse. Confirmation of what she'd always suspected about the man who'd raised her after her parents' deaths. He loved power more than people, even family. "Then do it," she said quietly. "But know that whatever you do to me, you do to the last living heir of the direct Vaelor line. When I'm gone, this house dies with me. So choose carefully, uncle, reputation or legacy." She didn't wait for his response. She walked out. Her hands didn't start shaking until she'd made it halfway down the corridor. Alsac. Seris locked herself in her chambers and sent word to the only person in the Empire who might understand what it meant to be trapped between duty and truth. She sent word to Vaeren. The message went through channels so obscure they bordered on mythological, a network of couriers and informants that existed in the gaps between official intelligence and noble gossip. It cost her 3 months of savings and a promise of future favors she might not live long enough to fulfill. The message was simple. "I need sanctuary. Come if you can. Don't if you can't." No explanation, no plea. Just coordinates and a time frame. She didn't expect a response. Alpha Kings didn't abandon their empires for women carrying inconvenient truths. 3 days later, a rider arrived at Valtheris Palace under cover of a merchant caravan. He carried a letter sealed with black wax and the sigil of the Draxir Dominion. Seris broke the seal with trembling fingers. The message inside was written in Vaeren's hand, sharp, efficient, unmistakable. Black Hollow Citadel. 3 weeks. Come alone. And then, beneath it, a single line that felt like an anchor in a storm. "You are not alone in this." Seris read the words until they blurred. Then she began planning her escape. Leaving Valtheris required the kind of calculation usually reserved for military campaigns. Seris couldn't simply walk out the front gates. Malrek had stationed guards at every exit. Her movements were monitored, her handmaidens questioned. Even the kitchen staff reported to his network. But prisons built by men who underestimated women always had cracks. Seris had spent 23 years learning where those cracks lived. She used the old servants' passages that honeycombed through Valtheris' foundations. Tunnels built during the siege wars, now abandoned except by rats and ghosts. She moved at night when the guards changed shifts and attention slipped. Mira helped. Gods bless her, Mira helped without asking questions. The night of her escape, Seris dressed in travel-worn clothing that smelled of road dust and sweat. She carried nothing except a leather satchel containing currency, identification papers forged by a counterfeiter Mira knew, and one item of sentiment, a book of philosophical essays Vaeren had given her during the summit. Before she left, she stood in her chambers one last time. The mirror reflected a woman who looked nothing like nobility. Hair braided tight, face bare, eyes hard. She looked like someone who'd chosen survival over performance. She looked free. The journey to Black Hollow Citadel took 2 weeks of brutal travel across terrain designed to kill the unprepared. Seris hired guides who asked no questions and forgot faces for the right price. She slept in roadside inns where the beds carried lice and the food tasted like salted leather. She walked until her feet bled inside her boots and learned to ignore the constant nausea that came in waves. The pregnancy made everything harder. She was sick most mornings, exhausted by afternoon. Her body felt like it belonged to someone else, hijacked by biological processes she couldn't control. But she kept moving, because the alternative was returning to Valtheris and letting Malrek decide her future. Black Hollow Citadel appeared on the 13th day of travel, rising from volcanic cliffs like a monument to power earned rather than inherited. The fortress was carved directly into the mountain face, all dark stone and sharp angles, with towers that looked like claws scraping the sky. Below, the silver sea crashed against rocks with the kind of violence that reminded visitors that nature didn't recognize sovereignty. Seris stood at the base of the approach road, staring up at the citadel, and felt something she hadn't felt since childhood. Hope, or maybe just the absence of immediate danger. Close enough. The guards at the outer gate recognized her from the description Vaeren must have provided. They didn't question, didn't delay, just escorted her through the massive iron doors and into corridors that smelled of cedar smoke and forged steel instead of court perfume. Everything about Black Hollow felt raw, honest, like a place built for people who didn't have energy left for performance. Vaeren met her in the Eastern Solar, a circular room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sea. He stood with his back to the door, hands clasped behind him, silhouette sharp against the afternoon light. When he turned, Seris saw what survival in the public eye had cost him. Vaeren Draxir was 37, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical presence that made rooms feel smaller. His hair was dark with threads of premature silver. His face was all hard angles and scar tissue from battles he'd led personally. His eyes were the gray of winter storms. Those eyes found hers across the solar, and something in his expression cracked. Not pity. Recognition. The look of one person who'd carried impossible weight, seeing another person doing the same. Seris, he said. Just her name. Like a complete sentence. She tried to speak. Couldn't. Everything she'd held together for 2 weeks suddenly threatened to collapse. Vaeren crossed the solar in 3 strides and caught her before she fell. Not as a king, not as a political ally. As the man who'd promised she wouldn't carry this alone. She broke in his arms. All the fear, rage, and exhaustion she'd weaponized into forward motion finally found release. She wept against his chest while he held her steady and said nothing because some moments didn't need words. When she finally pulled back, her face was blotched and her eyes were swollen, and she'd never looked less like nobility. Vaeren looked at her like she was the most honest thing he'd seen in years. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. 2 months. Maybe 3. Time started blurring. And Malrek? Suspects. Maybe knows. I left before he could confirm. Varen's jaw tightened. He'll come looking. Let him. This is Sovereign Draxir territory. He has no authority here. That won't stop him. I know. Vaeren studied her face with the careful attention of someone reading terrain before a battle. Are you certain? He asked. About this. About the child. About... He gestured vaguely, encompassing everything between them. Seris met his eyes. I've never been certain about anything in my entire life. I was raised to perform certainty, to wear it like armor. But actual certainty? That's a luxury people like us don't get. She placed her hand over her abdomen. But I'm certain I'm tired of letting other people's fear decide what I'm allowed to want. Varen's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, something heavier. That's the most dangerous thing you've ever said to me. I know. Good. He stepped back, giving her space to breathe. You'll stay here as long as you need. No conditions. No negotiations. Black Hollow is neutral ground. Nothing is neutral when it involves us, Seris said. Then we make it neutral. Through force if necessary. You'd start a war over this? Varen's voice went quiet, cold. The tone of a king who'd made harder choices and survived the consequences. I've started wars over less important things. An heir to 2 enemy houses, a child who could rewrite the political map of the empire. That's not scandal, Seris. That's leverage, and I protect what's mine. The possessiveness in his voice should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing anyone had said in months. Yours, she repeated. That's a dangerous claim. Most true things are. Seris looked at him. This man who ruled through iron discipline and brutal honesty, who'd somehow become the only person in the empire she trusted, and made a choice. Then I stay. Vaeren nodded once. Welcome to Black Hollow. Chico. The weeks that followed felt like learning to breathe after a lifetime of holding her breath. Seris adapted to the rhythms of Black Hollow with the relief of someone finally allowed to stop performing. No court functions. No diplomatic theater, no constant surveillance disguised as concern. Just space. Vaeren gave her the eastern wing, a suite of rooms with windows overlooking the sea, and enough privacy to rebuild herself in peace. He didn't hover, didn't demand gratitude or explanations. He simply remained. Present but not suffocating, available but not intrusive. It was the strangest form of intimacy she'd ever experienced. They fell into routines that felt accidental but were probably deliberate. Evening walks along the citadel ramparts while the wind howled and the ocean crashed below. Shared meals where conversation ranged from philosophy to governance to the small absurdities of ruling people who constantly wanted to kill you. Vaeren read to her at night when the pregnancy made sleep impossible. Old epics, forgotten histories, poetry that didn't flinch from darkness. His voice was steady, grounding. She began to understand why his soldiers followed him into battles they should have fled. One night, 3 weeks into her stay, Seris sat in the library watching firelight dance across ancient stone while Vaeren paced nearby, reading correspondence from his advisors. She studied him when he wasn't looking. The way he held tension in his shoulders, the slight limp he tried to hide from a battlefield injury that had never healed properly, the unconscious habit of touching the scar along his jaw when he was thinking. He looked exhausted, not from work, from the performance of being a king. "You don't have to do this," she said suddenly. Vaeren looked up from his letters. "Do what? Protect me. House me. Risk your position for a situation you didn't create." He set the correspondence aside and crossed to where she sat. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of too many years watching power destroy people from the inside out. "My father ruled the Draxir dominion for 43 years. He was beloved, feared, respected. When he died, 10,000 people mourned in the streets." Varen's expression went distant. "I found him in his private chambers the night before his death, alone, staring at his reflection like he couldn't recognize the man looking back. He told me the crown had hollowed him out, that he'd spent so long performing strength that he'd forgotten what actual strength felt like." He looked at Seris with terrible honesty. "I won't die that way. Empty. Surrounded by applause I don't trust. If protecting you cost me reputation or alliances or political capital, then those things were always worthless." Seris felt something shift in her chest. "You're a terrible king," she whispered. Vaeren smiled. Actually smiled. "I know. That's what makes me dangerous." Mishag. Lord Malrek Vaelor arrived at Black Hollow under storm-dark skies and black ceremonial banners, leading a delegation of 30 guards and 5 senior advisors. Seris watched from the eastern tower as the procession approached the citadel gates like a funeral march designed to intimidate. She'd known he would come. She just hadn't expected him to bring war with him. Vaeren stood beside her, face carved from stone, eyes tracking the approaching threat with the cold calculation of a general reading enemy formations. "He wants spectacle," Vaeren said quietly. "Public confrontation. Pressure through witnesses. Will you give it to him?" "No, I'll give him law." He turned from the window. "Stay here. Let me handle this." Seris grabbed his wrist. "He's my uncle. My fight." Vaeren looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. "Not anymore. The moment you walked into Black Hollow, you became Draxir business. And I protect what's mine." There was that possessiveness again. This time Seris didn't question it. She just held tighter. "Be careful. He's not stupid, and he doesn't believe in mercy. Neither do I." Vaeren left. Seris stood alone at the window, watching the delegation reach the citadel gates, and understood with brutal clarity what was about to happen. This wasn't negotiation. This was war conducted through language instead of steel, and someone would leave Black Hollow broken. The confrontation took place in the throne hall, a massive chamber carved from volcanic rock and crowned with vaulted ceilings that made voices echo like judgments from gods. Vaeren sat on the obsidian throne that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him, not lounging, not relaxed, but occupying the seat with the kind of authority that didn't need performance. Beside him stood his most trusted advisors and the captain of his personal guard. Malrek entered flanked by his delegation, every step calculated for maximum impact. The two men stared at each other across the hall's length, old enemies meeting on new battlefield. "Alpha King Vaeren," Malrek began. His voice carried the practiced diplomacy of someone who'd weaponized courtesy. "I thank you for receiving us." Vaeren said nothing. Malrek continued. "I've come regarding a personal matter. My niece, Lady Seris Vaelor, left her home without notice or protection. I have reason to believe she sought sanctuary here." She did. The confirmation landed like a declaration. Malrek's expression tightened. "Then I request her immediate return. She is under my guardianship and protection. Her presence here is—" "Voluntary," Vaeren interrupted. "She came of her own will. She remains of her own will. And she is under the protection of Draxir law, which grants sanctuary to any who request it within sovereign territory." Malrek's voice went cold. "Draxir law doesn't supersede family obligation. It does inside these walls. You're harboring a woman who carries—" Vaeren rose from the throne. The movement was slow. deliberate, predatory. Careful, Lord Malrek. The next words you speak will determine whether this conversation remains diplomatic. The threat hung in the air like drawn steel. Malrek's jaw worked. When he spoke again, his voice shook with barely controlled rage. You've compromised her, dishonored her, made her a scandal that will destroy both our houses. I've given her choice. Something your house seems allergic to. This isn't about choice. This is about legacy. About bloodline. About fear, Vaeren said flatly. You're not angry because Seris made a choice. You're angry because she made a choice you couldn't control. And that terrifies you. Malrek took a step forward, his guards tensed. Varen's captain moved his hand to his sword hilt, the hall filled with the electric tension that preceded violence. You think you can just claim her? Malrek hissed. Make her yours through proximity and pretty words about protection? Vaeren descended the throne steps until he stood eye level with Malrek. I'm not claiming anyone, but I am telling you this. Seris stays until she decides otherwise. If you attempt to remove her through force or coercion, you'll discover exactly how far I'm willing to go to protect what's mine. The possessiveness in his voice made it clear. This wasn't political posturing. This was personal. Malrek stared at the Alpha King with something close to disgust. You're willing to start a war over a bastard child? Varen's voice dropped to the register he used before killing people. I've ended wars over less important things. Try me. The standoff stretched. Neither man blinked. Finally, Malrek stepped back. His expression twisted into something cruel. Then keep her. But know this, Alpha King. When this scandal breaks, and it will break, your empire will remember that you chose your cock over your crown. He turned toward the doors. I hope she's worth the ruin. The delegation filed out. The massive doors closed. Vaeren stood alone in the echoing hall, fists clenched, breathing hard. Seris emerged from the shadows where she'd been watching. She'd ignored his command to stay away. Of course she had. Vaeren looked at her with eyes that carried the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade. This won't end quietly, he said. I know. Malrek will spread rumors, poison courts, turn allies against us. I know. Your reputation was always conditional, Seris interrupted. I'm done performing for people who only valued me when I stayed small and quiet. She crossed to where he stood. You asked if I was certain, earlier, about this, about us. Vaeren waited. I'm certain that I'd rather face scandal with someone who sees me than live safely with people who only see what I'm supposed to be. Something in Varen's expression cracked. He pulled her close. Not gently, desperately, like she was the only honest thing in an empire built on lies. Then we face it together, he said against her hair. Seris closed her eyes and allowed herself one moment of something she'd never had permission to feel before. Safety. Tits. But safety in empires built on blood was always temporary. And somewhere beyond Black Hollow's walls, storm clouds were gathering that no amount of courage or love could hold back. The real war was just beginning. The war Malrek promised didn't arrive with soldiers or siege engines. It came through whispers that spread like infection through the noble houses of the empire. Within a week of his departure from Black Hollow, every court from the northern provinces to the southern trade cities knew that Lady Seris Vaelor had fled her family home, that she'd taken sanctuary with the Alpha King, that she carried a child whose parentage would either unite two ancient enemies or destroy them both. The scandal moved faster than truth ever could. Some claimed Seris had been kidnapped. Others said she'd been bewitched. The most vicious rumors suggested she'd always been a Draxir spy, planted in House Vaelor to corrode it from within. None of the stories mentioned choice, because empires built on control couldn't afford to admit that women might choose their own destruction. Seris heard the rumors through Varen's network of informants. Reports arrived daily, each one more creative than the last in its cruelty. She read them alone in the eastern solar while winter storms battered the citadel windows and her body continued its relentless transformation. The pregnancy had entered its 5th month. Her abdomen had begun to swell in ways no amount of careful tailoring could hide. Morning sickness had evolved into exhaustion that hit like a physical blow. Some days she could barely stand for more than an hour without needing to rest. Her body had stopped being hers. It belonged to biology now, to the future. To a child who would inherit wars it didn't start. Vaeren found her there one evening, staring at a particularly vicious piece of correspondence that accused her of treason, sedition, and whoring in the same sentence. He didn't ask permission. He simply took the letter from her hands and threw it into the fireplace. They watched it burn together. "You don't have to read those," he said quietly. "I know, but ignoring them won't make them disappear." "No, but letting them poison you won't make you stronger." Seris looked at him. This man who ruled an empire but couldn't stop her from choosing her own pain. "How do you do it?" she asked. "Rule people who constantly want to destroy you. Make decisions knowing half your kingdom thinks you're a tyrant and the other half thinks you're weak." Vaeren was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd fought this battle alone for too long. "I stopped trying to be what they needed me to be. I started being what I could survive being." He turned from the fire to face her. "My father spent his entire reign performing strength. Every decision calculated for maximum appearance of power, every word chosen to inspire fear or loyalty or whatever emotion served the empire best. He died having never made a single choice that was just his." Varen's jaw tightened. "I watched that kill him. Not physically. Worse. It killed everything inside him that wasn't king. By the end, there was nothing left except the performance." He looked at Seris with an intensity that felt like being seen down to her bones. "So I made a choice. I decided I'd rather be a flawed king who remained human than a perfect king who became a monument. You think protecting me makes you flawed? I think protecting you makes me honest. And honesty in empires like ours is the most dangerous thing a ruler can practice." Seris felt something break open in her chest. Not pain, recognition. She'd spent her entire life believing that survival required becoming whatever the world demanded, malleable, adaptable, empty enough to be filled with other people's expectations. But Vaeren had chosen the opposite path. He'd survived by refusing to be anything except exactly what he was, even when it cost him everything. "That's the loneliest thing I've ever heard," she whispered. Vaeren smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Being king usually is. Bam. The political pressure intensified as winter deepened. Malrek had been busy. He'd spent the weeks since leaving Black Hollow poisoning every alliance Vaeren had carefully built over a decade of brutal diplomacy. Trade agreements suddenly fell apart. Military pacts were questioned. Border provinces that had sworn loyalty to the Draxir Dominion began making overtures to rival houses. The message was clear: support the Alpha King in his scandal, and House Vaelor would make you pay. Varen's advisors began requesting emergency councils. They arrived in his war room with faces carved from worry and voices tight with barely suppressed panic. General Torvik, a man who'd served 3 generations of Draxir kings, spoke with the bluntness of someone who'd earned the right to brutal honesty. "The southern provinces are wavering," he said without preamble. "Lord Malrek has convinced them that your protection of Lady Seris represents weakness. They're questioning whether you're fit to lead." "Let them question," Vaeren said flatly. "My king, this isn't symbolic posturing. We're looking at potential rebellion, real military threat." "From who? Old men too scared to admit the empire's been built on inherited fear?" Torvik's expression hardened. "From young commanders who see opportunity in instability. From houses that have waited generations for the Draxir Dominion to show vulnerability." He leaned forward across the tactical maps spread over the war table. "You're giving them that vulnerability, wrapped in silk and sentiment." Varen's voice went cold. "Careful, General. I've served your house faithfully for 40 years. I've earned the right to speak truth. And the truth is this: you're risking the empire for a woman. For a person," Vaeren corrected, "who deserves protection regardless of political convenience." Noble sentiment. Terrible strategy. The tension in the room thickened. Varen's other advisors exchanged glances, waiting to see if their king would bend or break. Vaeren did neither. He stood. The movement was slow, controlled, predatory. Every man in the room felt the shift. "I've spent 10 years consolidating power in this empire," Vaeren said quietly. "Fighting wars, negotiating treaties, sacrificing pieces of myself to maintain stability. And I've learned something that none of you seem to understand." He looked at each advisor in turn. Power built on fear is temporary. It lasts exactly as long as people believe you're willing to be cruel enough to maintain it. But the moment they sense you're exhausted, or hesitant, or human, that power evaporates. "So you agree this makes you look weak?" Torvik said. "No. I'm saying I've stopped caring whether it does." Vaeren's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "I won't become my father. I won't hollow myself out maintaining an empire built on inherited hatred and political theater. If protecting Seris cost me allies, then those alliances were always conditional. If it cost me respect, then that respect was based on performance rather than truth." He placed both hands on the war table and leaned forward. "And if it cost me the crown, then the crown was never worth having." The silence that followed felt like the moment before battle. Finally, Torvik spoke. "You're gambling with the lives of everyone in this dominion. I'm betting that ruling with humanity instead of cruelty might actually create something worth protecting." Vaeren straightened. "Meeting dismissed. If you can't support this decision, there's the door. I won't hold it against you." No one moved. Not because they agreed, because walking out would mean admitting their king had become someone they couldn't follow. And none of them were ready to face that truth yet. Seris began to understand the cost of Vaeren's protection when she overheard the servants talking. She'd been walking through the Citadel's lower corridors, avoiding the main halls where nobles and advisors conducted their endless political maneuvering. The pregnancy made her crave solitude. Quiet spaces where she didn't have to perform strength she didn't feel. She passed the kitchen entrance and heard voices. Two serving women discussing the scandal in hushed tones that carried farther than they intended. "The king's losing his mind over that Vaelor woman," one said. "My cousin serves in the southern garrison. Says half the commanders are questioning whether he's fit to rule. Can't blame them. Man's throwing away the empire for a piece of—" The second woman's voice dropped too low to hear. Seris's hands clenched. She should walk away. Ignore it. Let servants gossip without consequence. But something hot and furious was building in her chest. She stepped into the kitchen doorway. Both women froze. The sudden silence felt like guilt made audible. Seris looked at them with the cold precision she'd learned from years of surviving House Vaelor's political knives. "Finish your sentence," she said quietly. "My lady, I didn't," one began. "You didn't what? Mean for me to hear you call me a piece of property? Suggest I'm worth less than political strategy?" The women's faces went pale. Seris stepped forward. "Let me make something very clear. I didn't ask the Alpha King to protect me. I didn't seduce him or bewitch him or use any of the convenient excuses you're all using to avoid the uncomfortable truth." She let the words land like thrown stones. "The uncomfortable truth is that your king made a choice. He chose to prioritize a person over politics. And that terrifies all of you because it suggests that maybe, just maybe, the empire you've built doesn't have to run on fear and cruelty." One of the women found her voice. "We didn't mean disrespect, my lady. Yes, you did. You meant exactly what you said. You just didn't expect consequences." Seris turned to leave, then stopped. "For what it's worth, I don't blame you. You've been raised in an empire that teaches women to tear each other apart before we realize we're all trapped in the same cage." She walked away before either woman could respond. Her hands were shaking by the time she reached the eastern solar. Not from fear, from rage. The kind of rage that came from realizing that no matter what she did, there would always be people who saw her existence as threat or transaction, never just as person. Vaeren found her an hour later standing at the window watching storm clouds gather over the sea. He didn't speak immediately, just stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his presence. "I heard what happened in the kitchen," he said finally. "Of course you did. You hear everything in this citadel. Not everything, but enough." Seris kept her eyes on the storm. "They're right, you know. I'm costing you the empire. You're costing me an empire built on lies. There's a difference." She finally looked at him. "Is there? Or are you just better at justifying sacrifice than most people?" Varen's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "You think I'm lying to myself. I think you're a king who's been performing strength for so long, you don't know how to admit when something breaks you." The accusation hung between them. Vaeren was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a rawness she'd never heard before. "You want to know what breaks me? It's not losing allies or political capital or even the crown. It's watching you carry the weight of other people's judgment and knowing I can't protect you from it." He turned to face her fully. "I can guard you from physical threats. I can use law and military force to keep you safe inside these walls. But I can't stop the whispers. Can't control what people think or say or believe about you." His jaw tightened. And that's the real powerlessness of being king, knowing that the things that actually matter can't be commanded into submission. Seris felt something crack inside her chest. She'd spent weeks watching Vaeren be strong, controlled, certain. This was the first time she'd seen him admit to the fear underneath. "You don't have to protect me from everything," she said quietly. "Yes, I do. Because if I don't, then what the hell is the point of all this power?" Varen's voice broke on the last word. Seris reached for his hand. He let her take it. They stood together at the window while the storm moved closer and the empire they'd both been raised to serve continued tearing itself apart around them. The breaking point came 3 weeks later. Lord Malrek sent an official delegation to Black Hollow under the banner of diplomatic negotiation, but everyone knew what it actually was: an ultimatum. The delegation arrived with ceremony that bordered on theatrical: 50 guards in House Vaelor colors, 10 senior advisors, and Malrek himself, looking like a man who'd come to collect a debt written in blood. Vaeren received them in the throne hall. This time, Seris didn't hide. She stood beside the throne, visible to everyone, her pregnancy undeniable beneath the midnight blue gown she'd chosen specifically because it concealed nothing. "Let them see," she'd told Vaeren that morning. "Let them see exactly what they're so afraid of." The delegation entered. Malrek's eyes found Seris immediately. The expression on his face was complex: fury, disappointment, something that might have been grief buried beneath political calculation. "Alpha King Vaeren," he began. His voice echoed through the hall. "I've come with a proposal." Vaeren said nothing. Malrek continued. "Return Lady Seris to House Vaelor custody. We will handle the situation with discretion. The child will be cared for in a manner that protects both our houses from scandal." "By which you mean erased," Seris said. Her voice cut through the hall like a blade. Malrek's jaw tightened. "By which I mean protected, raised in a manner appropriate to what? Your fear? Your obsession with bloodline purity?" Seris stepped forward. "Say what you actually mean, Uncle. You want the child disappeared, hidden away where it can't threaten your carefully constructed legacy." The accusation landed. Malrek's composure cracked. "You selfish, ungrateful," he caught himself, breathed, forced control back into his voice. When he spoke again, the words came out measured, surgical. "I raised you after your parents died, protected you, gave you every advantage House Vaelor could provide. And this is how you repay that investment? By throwing yourself at our greatest enemy and bearing his bastard?" "Investment," Seris repeated. "That's what I was to you, an asset to be managed. You were family." "No. I was a strategic piece on your political board, and the moment I made a choice you couldn't control, I stopped being valuable." She moved closer to the edge of the dais. "So let's stop pretending this is about protection, or family, or anything except your terror that people might realize the empire you've spent your life maintaining is built on inherited fear instead of actual strength." Malrek's face went white, then red. "You have no idea what you've done," he said quietly. "The damage you've caused. I know exactly what I've done. I've proven that your power only works as long as people are afraid enough to obey. And you think that makes you brave? It makes you a fool. Maybe. But I'd rather be a fool who chose her own destruction than a coward who lived safely in a cage." The hall had gone completely silent. Every person present understood they were witnessing something rare and dangerous, the moment when inherited power met defiance and couldn't crush it through force. Malrek looked at Vaeren. "You'll allow her to speak to me this way?" "She's not mine to allow or forbid," Vaeren said flatly. "She speaks for herself." "Then you're both fools." Malrek gestured to his delegation. "My proposal stands. Return Lady Seris to House Vaelor, and we negotiate terms that protect both our interests. Refuse, and I will make it my life's work to destroy everything you've built." Vaeren stood. The movement was slow, deliberate. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Your proposal is refused. Lady Seris remains under Draxir protection as long as she chooses. The child she carries will be recognized as legitimate heir to both our houses. And if you attempt to interfere through force or political maneuvering, you will discover exactly how far I'm willing to go to protect what's mine." The possessiveness in his voice made it clear. This wasn't negotiation. This was war. Malric stared at them both with an expression that bordered on disbelief. "You're willing to burn the Empire over this. If the Empire can only survive through cruelty, then maybe it deserves to burn." Vaeren's words echoed through the hall. Malric's face twisted. "Then so be it." He turned toward the doors. His delegation followed. Before leaving, Malric looked back one final time. His eyes found Seris. "I hope you understand what you've chosen, because there's no coming back from this." "I know," Seris said quietly. Malric left. The doors closed. The hall filled with shocked silence. Seris felt her legs start to shake. Vaeren caught her before she collapsed. Not gently, desperately, like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to something real. "What have we done?" she whispered against his chest. Vaeren's voice was steady. "Survived." The political fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Within days, 3 major trade alliances pulled their support from the Draxir Dominion. Border provinces declared neutrality, which everyone understood meant they were preparing to side with whoever won the coming conflict. Noble houses that had sworn loyalty to Vaeren for decades suddenly found reasons to reconsider their oaths. The Empire was fracturing, not through war, through fear, because Vaeren had committed the ultimate transgression. He'd prioritized truth over performance. His advisors began abandoning him, not dramatically, not with grand pronouncements. They simply stopped showing up to councils, stopped responding to summons, quietly distanced themselves from a king they believed was committing political suicide. General Torvik was one of the last to leave. He came to Vaeren's private chambers late one night, looking older than his 60 years. "I can't follow you into this," he said without preamble. "I've given my life to the Draxir Dominion. Fought wars, lost friends, sacrificed everything to keep this empire strong." Vaeren looked at the man who'd been his father's most trusted commander. "And now you think I'm destroying it. I think you're gambling with something you don't have the right to risk. This empire belongs to millions of people, not just you." Vaeren was quiet for a long moment. "You're right," he said finally. "It does belong to them, but it also belongs to the future. And what kind of future am I building if it requires me to sacrifice the only honest thing I've done in 10 years of ruling?" Torvik's expression hardened. "Honest? You call this honest? You've put your personal desires above the welfare of your people." "I've refused to let fear make my decisions. There's a difference. Not to the people who will suffer when this empire collapses." Vaeren stood. "Then help me build something better, something that doesn't require constant cruelty to maintain." Torvik shook his head. "I'm too old to believe in better. I believe in survival." He turned toward the door. "I'm sorry, my king. I hope you survive what's coming, but I won't be here to watch you fall." He left. Vaeren stood alone in the sudden silence. Seris found him there an hour later, staring at nothing. She didn't ask what happened. She could see it written in the exhaustion carved into his face. "How many left today?" she asked quietly. 3 senior advisors, 2 generals, the trade minister." Vaeren's voice was flat. "Soon it'll just be us." Seris moved to stand beside him. "Are you afraid?" "Terrified." The admission shocked her. Vaeren had never admitted to fear before. He looked at her with eyes that carried the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade. "I'm afraid I've destroyed everything my father built. I'm afraid the empire will collapse, and it'll be my fault. I'm afraid you'll realize I'm not strong enough to protect you from what's coming." He took her hand. "But I'm more afraid of what I'd become if I let fear make this decision for me." Seris felt tears burning behind her eyes. "You're the strongest person I've ever met." Vaeren smiled. It looked like grief. "Then we're both doomed." Spring came late that year. Winter held the empire in its grip longer than usual, as if the weather itself was waiting to see which way the political winds would blow. Seris's pregnancy entered its 8th month. Her body had transformed completely. The swell of her abdomen was impossible to hide. She moved slowly, weighted down by the life growing inside her. Sleep came in fragments. Her back ached constantly. Simple tasks like walking upstairs left her breathless. But the child was healthy. The Citadel physicians confirmed it weekly. Strong heartbeat, good positioning, no complications. A miracle, considering the stress their mother carried. Vaeren had become increasingly protective as the due date approached. He barely left her side except for the most essential governance duties. He read to her at night, walked with her through the corridors when restlessness made sleep impossible, spoke to her growing belly with a tenderness that made her heart ache. One evening, they sat together in the eastern solar, watching the sun set over the silver sea. Varen's hand rested on her abdomen, feeling the child move beneath his palm. "Have you thought about names?" he asked quietly. "Some. Nothing feels right yet. What did your parents name you? Seris. What does it mean?" "Star. My mother said I was born during a meteor shower. She wanted me to remember that beautiful things could happen in darkness." Seris's voice caught. "I wish she could see this, see that her daughter didn't break under the weight." Vaeren was quiet for a moment. "I think she'd be terrified and proud. Usually, the best things are both." The child kicked, hard enough that Vaeren felt it against his palm. He smiled. "Strong," he said. "Like his parents. Or her parents." Varen's expression shifted, something vulnerable crossing his face. "I don't know how to be a father. My own father was a monument, impressive from a distance, cold up close." "Then don't be him. Be what you needed him to be." "What if I fail?" "Then you fail. But at least you'll fail trying to be human instead of perfect." Vaeren looked at her with an intensity that felt like drowning. "How did I survive before you? You didn't. You just performed survival well enough that no one noticed." The truth of it settled between them. Outside, the storm clouds were gathering again. But inside, in that moment, they allowed themselves to imagine a future where love didn't cost everything. Where choosing each other didn't mean choosing destruction. It was a fragile hope. But it was hope. And in empires built on fear, hope was the most dangerous weapon of all. The message arrived 3 days later. Lord Malrek had formed an alliance with the northern provinces and 3 southern border houses. Together, they represented nearly half the empire's military strength. They were demanding Varen's abdication. The terms were clear. Step down from the throne. Allow a council of noble houses to govern until a suitable replacement could be found. Surrender Lady Seris Vaelor to stand trial for treason and sedition. Refuse, and they would march on Black Hollow with an army. The deadline was 1 week. Vaeren read the message alone in his war room. Then he burned it. When his remaining advisors asked what his response would be, he gave them an answer that would echo through the empire for generations. "Tell them to come. I'll be waiting." The point of no return had been crossed. Now there was nothing left except to see who would survive it. The army arrived 6 days later, not with the theatrical pageantry of diplomatic delegations or the slow buildup of traditional warfare. They came like a storm that had been gathering on the horizon for months, finally breaking over Black Hollow with the inevitability of natural disaster. Seris watched from the eastern tower as the forces assembled across the valley below the citadel. Thousands of soldiers in the colors of House Vaelor and their allied provinces, siege equipment, supply trains, war banners snapping in the wind like vengeful spirits demanding blood. It was the largest military force assembled in the Empire in 3 generations, all of it aimed at one fortress, at one king, at her. Vaeren stood beside her, face carved from stone, eyes tracking the enemy positions with the cold calculation of a general who'd survived worse odds through sheer brutal competence. "How long can we hold?" Seris asked quietly. Vaeren was silent for a long moment. Black Hollow was designed to withstand siege. The volcanic cliffs make conventional assault nearly impossible. We have supplies for 6 months, water from underground springs, defensive positions that would cost them 10 men for every one of ours. That's not an answer. Varen's jaw tightened. We can hold indefinitely. The question isn't whether we can survive a siege, it's whether the Empire can survive us choosing to. Below them, the army continued its methodical preparation, setting up command tents, positioning artillery, creating the infrastructure of war. "This is what power looks like when it stops pretending to be civilized," Vaeren said, "when the performance breaks down and all that's left is force." He turned from the window. But here's what most people don't understand about force. It's expensive, not just in lives and resources. It's expensive in legitimacy. Malrek thinks he's demonstrating strength by marching an army to my gates. What he's actually doing is proving that his authority only functions through threat of violence. Then why does it feel like we're losing? Because empires are built on the collective agreement to pretend that violence is legitimate when it's sanctioned by the right people. And right now, Malrek has convinced enough of those people that we're the threat. Seris placed her hand on her swollen abdomen. The child had been restless all morning, kicking, moving, as if sensing the tension saturating the air. What happens when they realize neither side can win without destroying everything? Vaeren's expression went distant. Then we find out whether people value peace more than being right. The siege began that night, not with assault, but with isolation. Malrek's forces surrounded Black Hollow completely, cutting off every approach road and supply route. They didn't attack, didn't even make threats, just settled in with the patient inevitability of predators willing to starve their prey into submission. Inside the Citadel, life continued with the strange normalcy of people trapped in slow-motion catastrophe. Soldiers maintained watch rotations. Servants prepared meals. Advisors held councils that felt increasingly pointless as options narrowed to nothing. Seris found herself unable to sleep. The pregnancy made rest difficult anyway, but the knowledge that an army sat outside waiting for her surrender turned every quiet moment into suffocating awareness of how badly this could end. She walked the corridors at night, one hand pressed against the small of her aching back, the other trailing along cold stone walls. On the fourth night of siege, she found Vaeren in the war room, alone, staring at tactical maps that had been updated hourly with enemy positions. He looked exhausted, not physically, though that was there too. The exhaustion went deeper, the kind that came from carrying impossible weight with no relief in sight. "You should be resting," he said without looking up. "So should you. Kings don't get to rest during sieges." Seris moved to stand beside him. The maps were covered in markers representing enemy forces, red for infantry, black for cavalry, blue for siege equipment. The citadel sat at the center like a small island in a sea of hostile intent. "Tell me the truth," she said. "Can we actually survive this?" Vaeren was quiet for a long moment. "Militarily? Yes. Black Hollow is nearly impregnable. We could hold for months, maybe longer. But survival isn't the same as victory. Eventually resources run out, morale breaks, people start questioning whether the thing they're defending is worth the cost of defense." He finally looked at her. "Malrek is betting that my people will decide you're not worth dying for." The words landed like physical blows. "Are they wrong?" Vaeren's expression hardened. "That's not the question. The question is whether empires should be built on the principle that some people are worth protecting and others are acceptable losses." He gestured to the maps. "This is what inherited power looks like when challenged. It doesn't argue. It doesn't negotiate. It just brings enough force to crush dissent and calls it stability." "Then why are we fighting? If the system is designed to destroy anyone who questions it, what's the point of resistance?" Vaeren moved closer to her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion carved into every line of his face. "Because someone has to prove it's possible. Someone has to stand in front of an army and say, no, this person matters, and I will not sacrifice them to maintain your comfortable illusions, even if it costs you everything, especially then. Because if I surrender you to save my crown, what does that crown actually mean?" Seris felt tears burning behind her eyes. "You're the most stubborn man I've ever met." "I know. It's my worst quality. It's the only reason I'm still alive." Vaeren pulled her close, not gently, desperately, like she was the only thing keeping him from drowning in the weight of choices that had no good outcomes. "We're going to survive this," he whispered against her hair. Seris wanted to believe him, but she'd spent enough time in empires to know that survival was never guaranteed, especially not for people who chose love over strategy. The betrayal came from inside. Seris should have seen it coming. She'd spent her entire life learning to read the subtle signs of political maneuvering, the way people's eyes shifted when loyalty wavered, the careful neutrality in voices that used to carry warmth, the slow distancing that preceded abandonment. But she'd been so focused on the external threat that she'd missed the rot spreading inside Black Hollow's walls. It started with small things, supply inventories that didn't match records, guard rotations that left key sections undermanned, reports that arrived late or incomplete. Vaeren noticed first. He called an emergency council with his remaining loyal advisors, a group that had shrunk to barely a dozen people. "Someone is sabotaging our defenses," he said without preamble, "feeding information to Malrek's forces, undermining our supply chains." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. One of the younger advisors, a man named Kelris, who'd served Vaeren for 6 years, spoke carefully. "My king, perhaps it's not sabotage. Perhaps it's just the strain of siege conditions affecting efficiency." Varen's eyes went cold. "I've survived 3 sieges. I know what strain looks like. This is deliberate." "Then who?" "That's what we're going to find out." The investigation took 3 days. 3 days of interrogations, cross-referenced reports, and the slow, paranoid unraveling of trust that happened when communities turned on themselves. The answer, when it came, felt like a knife between the ribs. Captain Dreven, the man who'd commanded Varen's personal guard for 8 years, who'd saved the king's life twice in battle, who'd stood beside him through political upheaval and assassination attempts, the man Vaeren had trusted with his life. The evidence was incontrovertible. Coded messages found in Dreven's quarters, testimony from guards who'd witnessed him meeting with Malrek's agents under cover of darkness, financial records showing payments from House Vaelor accounts. Vaeren confronted him in the Citadel's holding cells. Seris insisted on being present. Against every advisor's recommendation, Vaeren allowed it. Dreven sat on the stone bench, hands bound, face carrying the exhausted resignation of someone who'd been caught and no longer had energy for lies. He looked up when they entered. His expression when he saw Seris was complex. Not hatred, pity. "Why?" Vaeren said. His voice was flat, empty of everything except the need to understand. Dreven was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weariness of someone who'd made a choice they knew was unforgivable. "Because you stopped being a king and became a man in love. And men in love make terrible rulers. That's not an answer, isn't it?" Dreven leaned forward. "I've watched you for 8 years. Seen you make decisions that cost you politically, but kept you human. Respected you for it. Even admired it." He gestured towards Seris. "But this isn't just political cost. This is choosing to let the empire burn because you can't let go of one woman. That's not leadership. That's selfishness dressed up as principle." Varen's jaw tightened. "You think handing her over to be destroyed is leadership? I think protecting millions of people is more important than protecting one." The old argument. The one that had justified every atrocity ever committed by people who believed they were serving the greater good. Seris felt something cold and hard crystallizing in her chest. "Did Lord Malrek pay you?" she asked quietly. "Or did you betray us for free?" Dreven's eyes shifted to her. "He paid. But not with money. With a promise that House Vaelor would support my family when the Draxir Dominion collapsed." "When?" she repeated. "Not if. When. Because this citadel might hold against siege, but kingdoms don't survive kings who choose personal desire over duty. And you get to decide what duty means?" "I get to decide what I can live with." Dreven's voice hardened. "You think you're brave for choosing love over politics. But you're not. You're just privileged enough to believe your choices shouldn't have consequences for anyone except yourselves." The accusation landed like thrown acid. Seris opened her mouth to respond. Vaeren stopped her with a hand on her arm. He looked at his former captain with an expression that carried the weight of every betrayal that had ever shaped him. "You're right about one thing. My choices have consequences. But here's what you don't understand. Every ruler makes choices that affect millions. The difference is whether you make those choices out of fear or conviction." He stepped closer to the cell bars. "I could surrender Seris, appease Malrek, maintain the Empire's stability. And I would survive. The crown would survive. Everything would continue exactly as it was." Varen's voice dropped to the register he used before killing people. "But I would spend the rest of my life knowing that when it mattered most, I chose comfortable cruelty over difficult truth. And that would hollow me out until there was nothing left except performance." He turned toward the door. Over his shoulder he said, "Execution is scheduled for dawn, for treason in time of siege." The sentence fell like a blade. Dreven's face went pale. "You can't," he began. "I can. I am. And I will sleep better knowing that traitors understand the cost of betrayal. Vaeren left. Seris followed. Behind them, Dreven's voice echoed through the stone corridor. This won't save you. Malrek already knows everything. Your defenses, your supplies, your plans. The words chased them like ghosts. Stats. The execution took place in the courtyard as the sun broke over the eastern mountains. Seris watched from the tower, one hand pressed against the cold glass, the other resting on her abdomen where the child continued its restless movement. Below, Vaeren stood witness as Captain Dreven was brought to the execution block. The man who'd saved the king's life. The man who'd sold that same king's trust for a promise of safety. Seris had seen executions before. House Vaelor had taught her that power required the occasional public demonstration of consequences. Deaths conducted with ceremony and justification. Theater designed to reinforce hierarchy. This felt different. This felt like watching Vaeren kill a piece of himself. The blade fell, quick, clean, merciful in its efficiency. Dreven's head rolled. His body collapsed. Blood spread across ancient stone that had witnessed too many deaths to count one more as significant. Vaeren stood motionless, watching. Then he turned and walked back toward the citadel. His face was empty of everything except exhaustion. Seris met him in the eastern corridor. She didn't speak, just took his hand and held it. His fingers were cold. I've ordered executions before, he said quietly. Enemies, criminals, people who threatened the Empire. He looked at her with eyes that had lost something fundamental. This was the first time I've had to execute someone I actually trusted. The weight in his voice felt like gravity collapsing. Seris pulled him close. He broke against her. Not with tears, with the kind of silent devastation that came from realizing that survival required cutting away pieces of yourself until you questioned whether the thing that remained was worth protecting. They stood together in the empty corridor, while the Empire outside continued its slow dismemberment of everything they'd tried to build. Book. Malrek's response to the execution was swift and calculated. He sent a message under flag of truce. Vaeren read it alone in his chambers. Then he summoned Seris. His face when she entered told her everything she needed to know. This was the end. What is it? She asked. Vaeren handed her the letter. Seris read, To Alpha King Vaeren Draxir. The execution of Captain Dreven confirms what I have long suspected. You have allowed personal attachment to override judgment. You rule not with wisdom, but with sentiment. I offer one final opportunity for resolution. Surrender Lady Seris Vaelor to stand trial before a council of noble houses. In exchange, I will withdraw my forces and recognize your continued sovereignty. Refuse, and I will order full assault on Black Hollow. Many will die. The citadel will fall. And when it does, Lady Seris will stand trial anyway, but you will not be present to witness it because you will be dead. You have until sunset tomorrow to decide. Choose wisely, nephew. The final word hit like a slap. Nephew. Seris looked up sharply. What? Varen's expression was carved from exhaustion and bitter recognition. My mother's maiden name was Vaelor. Malrek is my uncle, by blood. The revelation crashed through Seris's understanding like a wrecking ball through glass. You never told me. You never asked. And it never mattered. Half the noble houses in the Empire are related through marriage alliances. It's how political dynasties maintain power. He took the letter back. But Malrek is using it now, framing this as family intervention rather than political warfare, making himself look reasonable while making me look like a young king too blinded by lust to see truth. Is he wrong? The question came out before Seris could stop it. Varen's eyes snapped to hers. What? The child kicked, hard, like punctuation to a question Seris didn't want to ask, but couldn't avoid any longer. She forced herself to continue. Is he wrong? Have I blinded you? Have you sacrificed the Empire for me? Vaeren stared at her like she'd struck him. You can't actually believe that. I don't know what I believe anymore. I just know that people are dying, that your kingdom is collapsing, that everything you've built is being dismantled because you refuse to hand me over. Her voice broke. Maybe everyone's right. Maybe I am the problem. Vaeren crossed the room in 2 strides. He grabbed her shoulders. Not roughly, but firmly enough that she had to look at him. Listen to me. The Empire is not collapsing because of you. It's collapsing because it was built on a foundation of inherited fear and controlled cruelty. And the moment anyone challenged that foundation, the whole structure revealed how fragile it actually was. Then why does it feel like I'm destroying you? Because love in empires built on power always feels like destruction. It forces people to choose between comfortable cruelty and difficult truth. He cupped her face with both hands. I chose truth. I don't regret that. And I won't let you regret it either. Seris felt tears spilling over. What are we going to do? Vaeren's expression shifted, something she'd never seen before. Not defeat. Worse. Calculation. The look of someone who'd run out of good options and was now considering terrible ones. I'm going to meet with Malrek, he said quietly. Alone. The meeting was arranged for the following dawn in neutral territory, halfway between Black Hollow and Malrek's camp. Vaeren insisted Seris remain behind. She refused. They argued for an hour. Finally, Vaeren relented with one condition. She would remain with the guard escort, out of immediate danger but close enough to witness whatever happened. It was the worst compromise either of them had ever agreed to. They rode out as the sun broke over the mountains, turning the valley floor from shadow to gold. Malrek waited with his own guard detail, positioned exactly at the boundary line, like a man who understood that symbolism mattered as much as strategy. He looked older than Seris remembered. The siege had aged him too. Or maybe it was just the weight of orchestrating the potential destruction of his own blood. Vaeren dismounted, walked forward until he stood face to face with the man who'd raised him from boyhood after his mother's death. Uncle, Vaeren said. The word carried layers of accusation and grief. Malrek's expression remained neutral. Nephew, I'm pleased you came to your senses. I came to hear your terms. You've read them. I've read words on paper. I want to hear you say them, out loud. To my face. Malrek's jaw tightened, but he spoke. Surrender Lady Seris Vaelor to stand trial. In exchange, I withdraw forces and recognize your sovereignty. And if I refuse, then I order assault. Black Hollow falls. You die. Seris dies. The child dies. And the Empire fragments into civil war that will burn for generations. All this to maintain bloodline purity? Malrek's voice went cold. All this to maintain order, to preserve the structures that keep millions of people from descending into chaos. He stepped closer. You think you're being noble, heroic, standing against inherited oppression, but you're just a boy playing at revolution without understanding what revolutions actually cost. And you're an old man clinging to power by convincing yourself that cruelty is duty. The accusation hung between them. Malrek's face twisted. I raised you better than this. You raised me to be exactly this. You taught me to question inherited wisdom, to value truth over performance. You just assumed I'd only apply those lessons in ways that served you. Vaeren's voice hardened. But I learned too well, Uncle. I learned that power built on fear is temporary, that empires maintained through cruelty eventually consume themselves, that the only way to break the cycle is to refuse to participate in it. Then you've learned nothing. Malrek gestured toward the army assembled behind him. Look at what your refusal has created. War, suffering, potential collapse of everything our family's built over centuries. Good. The single word fell like a stone into still water. Malrek's eyes widened. Good. If the Empire can only survive through sacrificing people who threaten its comfortable lives, then maybe it deserves to collapse. Vaeren's voice carried absolute conviction. You want me to surrender Seris to save the Empire. But what you're actually asking me to do is prove that the system works, that authority can compel obedience through sufficient threat, that individuals don't matter when measured against collective stability. He met Malrek's eyes. I won't do it. Not because I'm blinded by love, but because I refuse to participate in a system that requires constant sacrifice of humanity to maintain itself. Then you're a fool. Maybe. But I'd rather be a fool who dies standing for something true than a wise man who survives by kneeling to fear. The words echoed across the valley. Behind them, both armies waited. Malrek's face had gone pale with rage. You've left me no choice. You've always had a choice. You just keep choosing power over people. Malrek turned away. The assault begins at sunset. He started walking back toward his lines, then stopped, looked back over his shoulder. I'm sorry it came to this, nephew. I genuinely hoped you'd be better than your father. Stronger. Wiser. Vaeren's expression didn't change. I am better. That's why this terrifies you. Malrek left. Vaeren stood alone in the space between armies. Seris watched from the guard escort, heart hammering, hands pressed against her abdomen where the child had gone still, as if even the unborn could sense what was coming. They returned to Black Hollow in silence. The Citadel felt different now. Not safer, just final, like a tomb waiting to be sealed. Vaeren went immediately to the war room to prepare defenses for the coming assault. Seris went to the eastern solar. She stood at the window watching the sun track across the sky toward sunset, toward the moment when everything would either survive or shatter. Her body ached, not just from pregnancy, from the weight of understanding that she'd become the fulcrum on which an empire's future balanced, and she couldn't decide whether that made her powerful or powerless. Both, probably. The door opened behind her. She didn't turn. Vaeren's footsteps crossed the solar. He stood beside her at the window. Together they watched the sun sink toward the horizon like a closing fist. I'm sorry, Seris said quietly. For what? For being the reason you're losing everything. Vaeren took her hand. You're the reason I finally found something worth losing everything for. That's not comfort, I know, but it's truth. They stood in silence while the sky bled from gold to red to purple. The child kicked. Seris placed Vaeren's hand over the movement. He's fighting, Vaeren said softly. Or she. Or she. They smiled. It felt like grief. Because they both understood what sunset would bring: violence, death, the brutal arithmetic of power asserting itself over principle. But they also understood something that people like Malrek never would. That some things were worth defending even when defense was hopeless. That choosing love over fear, even once, even at the cost of everything, was the only way to prove that empires built on cruelty weren't inevitable. That humanity mattered more than survival. The sun touched the horizon. Across the valley, war horns began to sound. The assault was beginning. Vaeren pulled Seris close. Whatever happens, he whispered, I want you to know that this was the most honest thing I've ever done. Seris pressed her face against his chest and allowed herself to break, because there were no more masks left to wear, no more performances left to give, just two people who'd chosen truth over survival and were about to discover whether that choice had been brave or simply suicidal. The horns grew louder, the army began to move, and in the eastern solar of Black Hollow Citadel, an Alpha King and the woman who'd cost him his empire held each other and waited for the end, or the beginning. Neither of them knew which anymore. The first wave hit Black Hollow's outer defenses as the sun disappeared completely behind the western mountains. Not with the chaotic rush of desperate men, but with the methodical precision of professional soldiers executing a plan they'd rehearsed for days. Siege towers rolled forward on reinforced wheels, while archers provided covering fire and infantry advanced behind portable shields that could deflect everything except direct artillery hits. Malrek had brought the full weight of his coalition to bear, and he intended to crush resistance through overwhelming force. Seris watched from the eastern tower as fire bloomed along the ramparts where Vaeren's defenders met the assault. The sound of it reached her seconds later, the clash of steel on steel, the screaming of injured men, the deep concussive thunder of catapult stones striking stone walls. War had always been abstract to her before, something discussed in council chambers with clinical detachment, numbers on reports, strategic positions on maps, the sanitized language of military planning that made death sound like mathematics. This was different. This was real. And it was happening because she'd refused to disappear quietly, her hands pressed against the cold glass, feeling the vibrations of impact travel through the Citadel's ancient foundations. The child inside her moved restlessly, responding to her elevated heartbeat with kicks that felt like protests against being brought into a world determined to destroy itself. A knock at the door pulled her attention away from the carnage below. Mira entered, face pale, carrying a bundle of thick fabric. My lady, she said quietly, the king requests you move to the inner chambers. The eastern tower is too exposed if they breach the outer walls. Seris didn't move. How bad is it? Mira hesitated, then chose honesty. We're holding, but barely. They have 10 times our numbers and siege equipment designed to crack fortifications stronger than ours. She set the bundle down on the nearby table. The king also sent these. Protective padding, in case the citadel falls and I need to flee. Seris finished the sentence, Mira couldn't. The handmaiden nodded. He's prepared evacuation routes through the lower tunnels. They lead to the cliffs. There are boats hidden in the cove below. Boats for what? Running? Hiding? Waiting until Malrek's forces hunt me down somewhere quieter? Seris's voice came out sharper than intended. Mira flinched. I'm sorry, Seris said immediately. That wasn't fair. It's all right, my lady. Fear makes everyone cruel. The simple truth of it landed like a slap. Seris looked at the woman who'd risked everything to help her escape Valtheris, who'd stayed loyal through scandal and siege when every rational instinct should have told her to run. Why are you still here, Mira? You could have left weeks ago, found safety somewhere far from this madness. Mira's expression softened. Because I spent my whole life watching women disappear when they became inconvenient. Saw my own mother vanish after she bore a child to a nobleman who didn't want the complication. I was 8. Never saw her again. Her voice went quiet. So when I watched you refuse to disappear, refuse to let powerful men erase you, just because your existence complicated their plans, I decided that if you were brave enough to stand, I was brave enough to stand with you. Seris felt tears burning behind her eyes. That's the most foolish thing I've ever heard. I know. They smiled at each other. The kind of smiles people exchanged when they understood they might die for choosing principle over survival. Another explosion rocked the citadel. Closer this time. Mira's expression shifted to urgency. Please, my lady, move to the inner chambers, for the child, if not for yourself. Seris looked down at her swollen abdomen. The child who would never know peace if this was the world they inherited. She nodded. All right. The inner chambers were carved deep into Black Hollow's volcanic foundations, surrounded by layers of stone thick enough to withstand direct artillery bombardment. They were also suffocating. No windows, limited ventilation, just torchlight casting dancing shadows across walls that felt like they were slowly closing in. Seris paced, back and forth across the small space like a caged animal, one hand pressed against her lower back where the ache had intensified to something that bordered on actual pain. Stress, she told herself. Just stress and the physical strain of late pregnancy combining into discomfort that mimicked something worse. But the contractions that had started an hour ago suggested otherwise. She'd been tracking them without telling anyone, 15 minutes apart, then 12, now 10. Her body had chosen the absolute worst possible moment to begin the process of bringing new life into a world that was actively trying to end hers. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. Another contraction hit. Seris braced herself against the stone wall, breathing through the pain the way the Citadel physicians had instructed during their examinations. When it passed, she found Mira watching her with eyes that had gone wide with understanding. How long, Mira asked. 2 hours. Maybe 3. Does the king know? No. And you're not going to tell him. My lady, he's fighting a siege. The last thing he needs is the distraction of knowing I'm in labor while his citadel is being destroyed around us. Mira's jaw set with the stubborn determination of someone who'd spent years taking orders but knew when to ignore them. You need a physician. We both know what bringing a physician down here would signal. Panic. Distraction. Exactly what you just said we can't afford. Seris forced herself to stand straight. I've watched enough births to know the basics. First children take hours. We have time. That's not... Another contraction cut Mira off mid-protest. Seris gripped the table edge, knuckles going white, breathing through pain that felt like her body was tearing itself apart from the inside. When it passed, she looked at Mira with an expression that allowed no argument. You stay with me. We handle this quietly. And we pray the Citadel holds long enough for this child to be born into something other than an active war zone. Mira stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most reckless. Probably both. Above them, the battle intensified. Vaeren stood on the main rampart, sword drawn, armor splattered with blood that wasn't all his own, watching his defenses slowly crumble under the relentless assault. They'd held for 3 hours. 3 hours of brutal fighting that had cost Malrek's forces dearly, but was costing Black Hollow everything. The outer wall had been breached in 2 places. Enemy infantry was pouring through the gaps like water through cracked stone. His defenders were falling back to secondary positions, abandoning ground they couldn't hold to consolidate around the citadel's core. It was textbook defensive strategy. It was also the beginning of the end. General Kane, one of the few senior officers who'd remained loyal, appeared at Vaeren's side. The man's face was carved from exhaustion and something that looked like resignation. "My king, we need to fall back to the inner keep. The main courtyard is lost." Vaeren looked out across the chaos. Men were dying. His men. Loyal soldiers who'd followed him into this catastrophic choice and were paying for it with their lives. "How many have we lost?" 200 confirmed dead, 3 times that wounded. And they keep coming. Kane's voice cracked. "We can't hold them. We don't have to hold them. We just have to make them pay so dearly for every inch that Malrek questions whether victory is worth the cost." Vaeren wiped blood from his eyes. Not his own. From a soldier who'd died 3 feet away defending a position they'd lost anyway, and felt the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade. This was what power looked like when stripped of ceremony and performance. Not crowns and thrones and the abstract exercise of authority. Just violence. And the question of whether the thing you were defending justified the bodies piling up to defend it. Every ruler faced this calculation eventually. The moment when maintaining your position required asking other people to die for it. Most rulers made that choice without hesitation. They called it duty, necessity, the burden of leadership. Vaeren had spent 10 years making that choice. But something was different now. Now he was asking people to die not for the Empire's stability or strategic advantage or abstract greater good. He was asking them to die so he could protect one person. One pregnant woman whose only crime was choosing love in an empire that demanded obedience. The mathematics of it should have been simple. 1 life versus thousands. Any rational calculus would sacrifice the one. But Vaeren had finally understood something his father never had. The moment you started measuring lives against each other, deciding which people mattered and which people were acceptable losses, you'd already lost the thing that made leadership worth having. You'd become just another tyrant with better justifications. "My king," Kane said urgently. "Orders?" Vaeren looked at the general who'd served him faithfully through battles that should have killed them both. "Controlled retreat to the inner keep. Every man who can still walk. Leave nothing useful for them. Burn the supplies, poison the wells, make them earn every stone." His voice went cold. "And if they breach the inner keep, I want every man capable of fighting to fall back to the throne hall. We make our stand there." "That's—" Kane caught himself. "Suicide," Vaeren finished. "I know. But if we're going to die defending something, we die defending it honestly. No more retreats, no more compromises." He turned to face the general. "And Kane, when the end comes, I want you to take Lady Seris through the evacuation tunnels. Get her to the boats. Get her far from here. She won't leave you." "I know. You'll have to force her. My king." "That's an order." Kane's expression twisted with something that looked like grief, but he nodded. Understood. In the deep chambers below, Seris's labor intensified as the battle above reached its crescendo. The contractions were coming every 5 minutes now. Each one felt like being torn apart. She'd stopped trying to hide the pain. Mira had fashioned a makeshift birthing station using cushions and linens, following half-remembered instructions from watching deliveries in House Vaelor's servant quarters. Neither of them mentioned that those deliveries had been supervised by experienced physicians with proper equipment and supplies. Neither of them mentioned that complications during birth killed women and children with depressing regularity, even under ideal conditions. They just focused on the immediate. One contraction at a time. One breath at a time. One moment of survival at a time. Seris gripped Mira's hands hard enough to leave bruises as another wave of pain crashed through her. "How much longer?" she gasped when it passed. Mira checked with hands that shook despite her attempts at calm. "You're close, very close. Maybe another hour." An explosion somewhere above them shook the chamber. Dust rained from the ceiling. The timing felt like cosmic mockery. Her child was about to be born into a world that was actively trying to kill them all. "I can't do this," Seris whispered. Not from weakness. from the crushing awareness of what she was bringing this child into. "Yes, you can," Mira said firmly. "No. You don't understand. What kind of mother brings a child into this? Into war and siege and an empire that wants us dead? The same kind of mother who refused to let powerful men erase her. The same kind who chose truth over safety." Mira's voice hardened. "This child is being born to a woman who looked at an empire built on fear and said no. That's not weakness. That's the bravest thing I've ever witnessed." Another contraction. Harder this time. Seris screamed. She didn't care who heard anymore. Didn't care about dignity or composure or any of the performative strength she'd maintained through months of scandal and siege. There was only pain and the animal instinct to survive it. When the contraction passed, she found herself weeping, not from pain, from fear. Pure, undiluted fear that this was how it ended. Dying in childbirth in a basement while the man she loved fought a hopeless battle above, and the empire they'd challenged finally crushed them both. "My lady," Mira said urgently, "I need you to push. I can't." "You can. You have to. The baby's crowning." Seris felt pressure that made the previous pain feel insignificant by comparison. She pushed, and understood viscerally why women describe childbirth as closer to death than anything except dying itself. The inner keep fell 20 minutes later. Vaeren and his remaining forces, barely 100 men still capable of fighting, retreated to the throne hall as planned. The massive chamber that had witnessed councils and judgments and the ordinary machinery of governance now transformed into a final defensive position. His soldiers barricaded the doors, positioned archers at the gallery level, prepared for last stand with the grim efficiency of men who knew they were about to die but chose to make their deaths expensive. Vaeren stood before the obsidian throne, sword in hand, watching the doors shake under the impact of a battering ram. He thought about his father, the man who'd ruled for 43 years and died hollow. He thought about the choices that had led here, every decision that had seemed so clear in the moment but looked like catastrophic arrogance in retrospect. He thought about Seris, somewhere below, safe for now, carrying their child into a world that was collapsing around them. And he realized with brutal clarity that he'd failed. Not morally. He still believed in everything he'd fought for. But practically. He'd gambled that principle could withstand force, that standing for truth would inspire others to stand with him, that love was strong enough to remake empires built on fear. He'd been wrong, or maybe just too early. Maybe in some future generation, someone would look back at this moment and understand what he'd tried to do. But right now, in the immediate present, he was just a king about to die defending a choice that most people would call foolish. The doors splintered. Enemy soldiers poured through. Vaeren raised his sword. "For Draxir," he shouted. His men answered. The battle that followed was brutal and short. Vaeren fought like a man with nothing left to lose. Cut through enemy soldiers with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades mastering violence. But there were too many. Always too many. One by one, his defenders fell, until only Vaeren remained, standing alone before the throne, surrounded by bodies and blood and the ruins of everything he'd tried to build. Malrek's forces parted. The old man himself walked through, still wearing the formal robes of diplomatic ceremony rather than armor, making a point that this had never been about warfare. It had been about authority asserting itself over defiance. He stopped 10 feet from Vaeren. The two men stared at each other across a space littered with consequences neither could undo. "Yield," Malrek said quietly. "No. This is over, nephew. Your citadel has fallen. Your forces are dead or scattered. You've lost." Vaeren tightened his grip on his sword. Blood dripped from the blade. "I've lost nothing that mattered." Malrek's expression twisted. "You've lost everything. Your kingdom, your crown, your life, but not my soul." The words echoed through the ruined throne hall. Malrek stepped closer. "Where is she?" Not a question, a demand. "Somewhere you'll never find her. We'll search every chamber, every tunnel, every hidden corner of this citadel. And when we find her..." "When you find her what? Execute her? The child? Prove to everyone watching that your empire survives through infanticide?" Varen's voice went cold. "Do it. Show the world what your authority actually requires." "You think I won't?" "I think you will. Because that's what power looks like when it's been challenged and has nothing left except violence. Malrek's face flushed. I gave you every chance to avoid this. No, you gave me every chance to submit. There's a difference. Vaeren straightened despite the exhaustion threatening to pull him down. You wanted me to prove that your system works, that authority can compel obedience through sufficient threat, that people can be forced to sacrifice what they love if the consequences for refusal are severe enough. He met Malrek's eyes. I won't give you that satisfaction. Then you die. Malrek nodded to the soldiers surrounding them. But before they could move, a sound cut through the hall. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. A baby crying. Everyone froze. The sound was coming from below, from the deep chambers. Malrek's expression shifted from rage to something more complex. He looked at Vaeren. She's in labor. Was. Understanding crashed across Malrek's face. The child was born. During the siege. While the Empire fought itself to pieces above, new life had arrived below. It was the kind of symbolic timing that would be remembered in histories and songs, if anyone survived to write them. Malrek gestured to his soldiers. Find them. The men moved towards the rear passages that led to the lower levels. Vaeren lunged, not toward Malrek, toward the soldiers, trying to stop them through sheer, desperate force. He took down two before the others swarmed him, dragged him to the stone floor, pinned him. No! Vaeren roared. The sound was animal, raw, the cry of someone watching everything they'd fought for slip away. Malrek stood over him. This is what defiance costs, he said quietly. This is what happens when rulers prioritize personal desire over duty. Vaeren stared up at him with eyes that burned with rage and grief and something that looked like pity. And this is what authority looks like when it has nothing left except the willingness to hurt people. I hope you can live with that, Uncle. I hope it keeps you warm when you're old and dying and realize that everyone who ever respected you only did so out of fear. Malrek's hand trembled. For a moment he looked like a man who wanted to respond, who wanted to justify or explain or somehow make this feel like something other than cruelty. But he said nothing, just turned and followed his soldiers toward the lower chambers, toward Seris, toward the child, toward the final destruction of everything Vaeren had tried to protect. And Vaeren, pinned to the cold stone floor by soldiers who'd won the battle, but looked like they were questioning whether victory was worth this cost, could do nothing except listen to his child's cries echo through the ruins of his kingdom and understand that some losses were too complete to survive. Malrek found them in the deepest chamber. Seris sat propped against cushions, hair plastered to her face with sweat, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in linen. Mira stood beside her, positioned between the new mother and the door, armed with nothing except fierce determination and a small knife that would be useless against soldiers. The baby had stopped crying, just lay against Seris's chest, making small sounds that might have been distress, or simply the noise of adjusting to existence outside the womb. Malrek stopped in the doorway. He looked at his niece, at the child, at the tableau of stubborn survival in the face of overwhelming force. When he spoke, his voice carried exhaustion that matched Seris's own. It's over. Seris looked up. Her face was pale from blood loss and pain, but her eyes were clear, defiant. I know. The king has fallen. The citadel is ours. You have no protection left. I never needed protection. I needed someone to see me as more than a strategic problem. Malrek stepped into the chamber. His guards followed. Mira tensed. Seris placed a hand on her arm. It's all right. To Malrek, she said, What now? Public execution? Quiet disappearance? Some creative solution that makes the scandal go away while maintaining the fiction that noble houses value life? Malrek was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the child, the baby who'd been born into war, who represented everything his political philosophy said was impossible. When he spoke, his voice was different, softer, tired. I came here to end this, to prove that empires survive through strength and discipline, that rulers who prioritize personal attachment over duty deserve to fall. He stepped closer. But looking at you now, holding that child, I realized something I should have understood years ago. His eyes met hers. I don't know how to end this without becoming exactly what Vaeren accused me of being. Then don't end it. Seris's voice was barely above a whisper. Let us go. Take your army. Declare victory. Tell whatever story maintains your authority. But let us go. And then what? You disappear into obscurity while I rule over an empire that watched me crush my own blood? Better than ruling over an empire that watched you murder an infant. The accusation landed. Malrek's face went pale. You think I would? I think you do whatever the empire demanded, just like you always have. The question is whether you have anything left inside you that remembers being human instead of just political machinery. The chamber filled with terrible silence, broken only by the baby's small sounds. Malrek looked at his niece, at the child who shouldn't exist, at the impossible situation that had no good resolution, and made a choice that would haunt him for whatever years he had left. He turned to his guards. Leave us. My lord, one protested. Now. The soldiers hesitated, then obeyed. The door closed. Malrek stood alone with Seris, Mira, and the child who'd broken an empire. What's the baby's name? He asked quietly. We haven't chosen yet. Boy or girl? Boy. Malrek nodded slowly. He looks like his father. Seris tightened her hold on her son. If you're going to kill us, do it quickly. Don't make this last longer than necessary. I'm not going to kill you. The words seemed to surprise him as much as her. Then what? Malrek moved to the stone bench against the wall, sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 62 years. I'm going to do something I swore I'd never do. I'm going to admit I was wrong. He looked at Seris with an expression that carried decades of accumulated regret. I raised you to be strong, to value the house above everything, to understand that survival required sacrificing personal desire for collective stability. His voice broke. But I never taught you how to be happy. Never showed you that life could be more than just performing strength until you died hollow. He gestured toward the ceiling, toward the ruined citadel above. And when you found someone who did, I tried to destroy it. Not because it threatened the empire, because it threatened my certainty that the way I'd lived my life was the only way to live. Seris stared at her uncle. This man who'd shaped her entire understanding of power. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm tired, because I'm old, because I just watched my nephew fight a hopeless battle, defending you, and realized that he had more courage in his defiance than I've ever had in my obedience. Malrek stood, moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the latch. There are boats in the cove below. Take them. Go somewhere far from here. Raise your son in peace. And you? I'll tell the Empire that you died in the assault, that the child didn't survive, that the threat has been eliminated. He looked back over his shoulder. It's the last gift I can give you, the freedom to disappear. What about Vaeren? Malrek's expression darkened. That's more complicated. Seris's heart clenched. Is he alive? For now, then I'm not leaving without him. Malrek's jaw tightened. You don't have the leverage to make demands. Seris looked down at the child in her arms, then understood. I don't. But you gave me leverage the moment you chose mercy over murder. She met her uncle's eyes. Because now you have to live with the fact that you let us go. And the only way that choice doesn't destroy you politically is if all of us disappear. She smiled. It wasn't warm. So you're going to help Vaeren escape. Not because you've suddenly become noble, but because the alternative is admitting you showed weakness. Malrek stared at her. Then, slowly, he smiled back. I taught you too well. You taught me perfectly. I just applied the lessons in ways you didn't expect. The silence stretched. Finally, Malrek nodded. I'll arrange it. But after tonight, you're on your own. I won't be able to protect you. We never needed your protection, Uncle. We just needed you to stop trying to destroy us. Malrek opened the door, paused. For what it's worth, I hope you find the peace I never could. He left. Seris sat holding her newborn son, listening to the sound of her uncle's footsteps fade. Mira knelt beside her. Did that actually just happen? I think so. Seris looked down at the baby's small, perfect face, at the child who'd been born into war but might actually survive to know peace. We have to move quickly, she said, before he changes his mind or someone discovers what he's planning. My lady, you just gave birth. You need rest. I'll rest when we're safe. Right now, we run. She stood. It took everything she had. But she stood. holding her son, ready to do what survival demanded, again. They brought Vaeren to the chamber an hour later. He was barely conscious, bleeding from wounds that needed immediate treatment, but alive. When his eyes focused enough to see Seris holding their child, his expression cracked. "We have a son," she said quietly. Vaeren reached out with a shaking hand, touched the baby's small fist. The child gripped his father's finger with the instinctive strength of new life. "What's his name?" Vaeren whispered. Seris looked at the man who'd sacrificed his kingdom for her, at the child who'd been born into impossible circumstances, at the future they might actually survive to see. "Aeron," she said. "It means sky. Freedom. Futures that no blood feud owns." Vaeren smiled through pain and exhaustion and grief for everything he'd lost. Perfect. Outside the chamber, Malrek was orchestrating their escape, spreading lies about deaths that never happened, arranging the kind of disappearance that would let him maintain power while giving them the only thing that mattered. A chance. Not guaranteed. Not safe. Just possible. And in empires built on inherited certainty, possibility was the most dangerous gift anyone could give. The boats waited in the cove below. The night waited to swallow them. The future waited, unknowable and terrifying in theirs. Seris helped Vaeren stand. Together, with their son between them and Mira at their backs, they walked toward the tunnels that would take them away from the only lives they'd ever known, toward something new, something uncertain, something that felt, for the first time in either of their lives, like it might actually be theirs to choose. Behind them, Black Hollow burned. The empire that had tried to destroy them fractured further, and two people who'd chosen love over fear disappeared into darkness, carrying their impossible sun toward a dawn that was still hours away. The tunnels beneath Black Hollow smelled of salt water and ancient stone and the accumulated darkness of centuries. Seris moved through them with her newborn son pressed against her chest, every step sending pain radiating through her body from the birth that had happened barely 2 hours ago. The bleeding hadn't stopped completely. Her legs trembled with exhaustion that went beyond physical into something that felt like her entire being was collapsing. But she kept moving, because stopping meant capture, and capture meant death for all of them. Vaeren leaned heavily on Mira, one arm draped across the handmaiden's shoulders, leaving a trail of blood drops on the tunnel floor that marked their passage like breadcrumbs for anyone who knew how to track. His wounds were worse than he'd admitted. The sword cut across his ribs was deep enough that Seris could see bone when she tried to bind it with torn fabric from her gown. He needed a physician. He needed rest. He needed things they couldn't provide while running for their lives through tunnels that might lead to freedom or might lead to a dead end where they'd die slowly from blood loss and despair. "How much further?" Seris asked quietly. Mira consulted the crude map Malrek had provided before sending them into the darkness. "Half a mile. Maybe less. The tunnel opens onto a sea cave where the boats are hidden. If they're actually there, Mira agreed. The unspoken fear hung between them, that this was all elaborate cruelty, that Malrek had sent them into these tunnels not as escape, but as tomb, that they'd reach the cave and find nothing except rocks and water, and the realization that mercy had been one final performance before letting nature finish what the siege had started. But they had no choice except to trust. Because the alternative was turning back toward the Citadel, where Malrek's forces were still searching for bodies to confirm the official story of their deaths. Aeron made a small sound against Seris's chest. Not crying, just the noise of a newborn adjusting to existence. She looked down at her son's small face, barely visible in the dim torchlight Mira carried. He had Vaeren's eyes. Already. That same gray that looked like winter storms. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the child who couldn't understand. "I'm sorry you were born into this. Into running and blood and parents who chose principle over safety. Don't apologize." Vaeren's voice was rough with pain. "Don't apologize for refusing to let them erase you." Seris looked at the man who'd sacrificed his kingdom for her. At the Alpha King who'd lost everything except the thing that mattered. "Was it worth it?" she asked. "All of this. The empire you lost. The lives that ended. The future you'll never have." Vaeren stopped walking, forced himself upright despite the agony it clearly caused. looked at her with eyes that carried the weight of choices that had destroyed him and somehow made him more complete. Every single moment. The certainty in his voice felt like an anchor. I spent 10 years ruling through fear and performance, building an empire that looked strong, but was actually just collective agreement to pretend violence was legitimate. And I hated every moment of it, even when I told myself it was necessary. He reached out with his free hand, touched Aaron's small head with fingers that shook. But these past months with you? Choosing to protect something real instead of something symbolic? That's the only time I've felt like the crown meant anything except weight. Even though it cost you the crown itself? Especially because of that. Because it proved the crown was never the thing that mattered. The choice was what mattered. The refusal to let fear make my decisions. Vaeren's expression shifted, something between smile and grimace. Most rulers die surrounded by power they can't trust, and people who only love the performance. I'd rather die in a tunnel with you and our son, knowing I chose truth. That's the most terrifying thing you've ever said to me. I know. They continued walking. The tunnel sloped downward. The sound of waves crashing against rocks grew louder. The air changed from stale darkness to salt-sharp wind, and then they emerged. The sea cave opened before them like a mouth carved from living stone by millennia of water and violence. Moonlight poured through the entrance, turning the water inside to liquid silver. And there, pulled up onto the rocky shore, sat 3 small boats exactly as Malrek had promised. Seris felt something crack inside her chest. Not relief. The realization that mercy was real, that her uncle had chosen to let them go even though it contradicted everything he'd spent his life believing about power and control and the necessity of sacrifice. That somewhere beneath the political machinery, he'd found something human enough to make a different choice. Mira moved to check the boats, while Seris helped Vaeren sit against the cave wall. He was fading. She could see it in the way his eyes struggled to focus, in the pallor of his skin, in the breathing that had gone shallow and labored. The blood loss was too severe. Even if they reached safety, even if they found physicians and supplies and everything needed for survival, she wasn't certain he'd make it. "Stay with me," she said quietly. Varen's eyes found hers. Always. The promise felt like both truth and lie, because some promises couldn't be kept through will alone. Some things required luck and time and circumstances they couldn't control. "The boats are sound," Mira called out. "Supplies loaded. Food, water, medical supplies, currency. Enough to get us far from here." She returned to where Seris knelt beside Vaeren. "But we need to move quickly. The tide is turning. If we don't leave within the hour, we'll be trapped here until the next low tide." Seris looked at Vaeren, at the man who could barely stand. "Can you make it onto the boat?" Vaeren pushed himself upright through visible agony. "I've survived worse." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." Together, with Mira supporting most of his weight, they got Vaeren into the largest boat. Seris climbed in after him, settling in the stern with Aaron still clutched against her chest. The child had fallen asleep. Blessed unconsciousness that meant he wouldn't cry and give away their position if anyone was searching the coastline. Mira pushed the boat into the water, then jumped aboard as waves caught them and pulled them toward the cave entrance. The current was strong, vicious, the kind of water that had drowned sailors who knew what they were doing. They were exhausted refugees in a small boat fleeing into darkness. The odds weren't good, but they'd survived worse odds. They'd survived an empire. Surely they could survive the sea. The boat cleared the cave mouth. Open water stretched before them, silver and black and infinite. Behind them, Black Hollow burned against the sky like a funeral pyre for empires built on inherited fear. Seris looked back once, at the citadel where she'd found sanctuary, at the place where her son had been born, at the ruins of the world they'd tried to change and had instead only managed to escape. Then she turned forward, toward whatever came next. Check. They sailed for 3 days, hugging the coastline when possible, moving to open water when necessary, following currents that Mira half remembered from childhood stories about smugglers and refugees who'd made this journey before. Vaeren drifted in and out of consciousness. Seris changed his bandages when the bleeding soaked through, using the medical supplies Malrek had included with a generosity that felt like guilt made manifest. She dripped water between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow, spoke to him during the long hours of darkness when nothing existed except the sound of waves and the fear that he wouldn't make it to morning. You have to survive this, she told him one night while Aeron slept and Mira manned the rudder. You don't get to sacrifice your kingdom for me and then die before we figure out what the hell we're supposed to do with the freedom you bought. Vaeren's eyes opened. Barely. Maybe that's the point, he whispered. Maybe the freedom is the thing. Not the life after. That's philosophy, not commitment. It's truth. I spent 10 years surviving, enduring, performing strength I didn't feel. These past months with you are the only time I've actually lived. Don't you dare turn this into noble sacrifice. You don't get to make this poetic. Vaeren smiled. It hurt him to smile, but he did it anyway. I'm not making it poetic. I'm making it honest. I'd rather have 3 months of truth with you than 3 decades of performance alone. Seris felt tears burning. You're an asshole. I know, a stubborn, self-destructive asshole who thinks dying for principle makes it worth dying. Yes. She leaned closer. So don't die. Live. Be stubborn about that. Be self-destructive about surviving. Vaeren's hand found hers, squeezed with strength that shouldn't have been possible given his condition. I'm trying. Try harder. They reached the coastal village of Maris on the 4th day, a fishing settlement small enough to avoid imperial attention, large enough to have a physician who'd learned his trade through necessity rather than formal training. The physician, an older man named Corin, who asked no questions and expected payment in advance, worked on Vaeren for 6 hours. Seris waited outside the small cottage with Aeron, pacing the length of the dirt path until Mira physically stopped her and made her sit. You're still healing yourself, Mira said firmly. You gave birth 4 days ago. You need rest. I need Vaeren to survive. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Seris looked down at her son, awake now, making small sounds, eyes trying to focus on a world that was too bright and too strange and too full of movement after the cramped darkness of the womb. What if he doesn't make it? She whispered. Then we survive anyway, because that's what we do. Mira's voice was gentle but unyielding. You've survived your parents' deaths, a guardian who treated you like property, an empire that wanted you erased, a siege, and childbirth during battle. You'll survive this too. I don't want to survive without him. I know, but want doesn't change what's necessary. The brutal truth of it landed. Seris had spent her entire life learning that survival required sacrificing what you wanted for what you could endure. She just hoped she was done with that lesson. The cottage door opened. Physician Corin emerged, wiping blood from his hands with a cloth that had seen better days. His expression was carefully neutral in the way that medical professionals learn to maintain when outcomes were uncertain. He'll live, Corin said. The words felt like absolution. But he's lost a lot of blood. The wounds were infected. Another day and sepsis would have killed him. As it is, he needs weeks of rest. No travel, no exertion, complete bed rest or the wounds reopen and we start this whole process again. Seris nodded. How much do I owe you? Corin named a price that would consume most of their remaining currency. She paid without hesitation. Some things were worth poverty. Can I see him? He's sleeping. Natural sleep, not unconsciousness. Best thing for him right now. Check back in a few hours. Seris wanted to argue. Wanted to sit beside Vaeren and watch his chest rise and fall just to confirm that he was actually alive, but she recognized wisdom when she heard it. Thank you, she said. Corin studied her with eyes that had seen too much suffering to be fooled by performance. You're refugees, he said quietly. Not a question. Seris considered lying, decided there was no point. Yes. From where? Somewhere that wanted us dead more than it wanted us alive. Corin nodded slowly. Those are the only kind of refugees there are. He turned to go back inside. Paused. You're safe here. For now. Maris doesn't ask questions about people's pasts. We're mostly exiles ourselves. But don't stay too long. Empires have long memories, and even small villages get noticed eventually. How long? Corin shrugged. Long enough to heal. Not long enough to get comfortable. He disappeared into the cottage. Seris stood holding her son, feeling the weight of temporary safety settle over her like a blanket that might be pulled away at any moment. But temporary was better than nothing, and nothing had been their reality for long enough. They stayed in Maris for 6 weeks, renting a small house on the edge of the village with the last of Malrek's currency and what little Vaeren had managed to bring from Black Hollow. The weeks passed in a rhythm that felt almost like peace. Mornings, Seris cared for Aeron, learning the brutal exhaustion of new motherhood without servants or support beyond Mira's fierce loyalty and practical competence. Afternoons, she sat with Vaeren while he recovered, reading to him from books borrowed from Corin's small library, discussing philosophy and governance and the question of what came next for people who'd burned their entire world to ash. Evenings, they ate simple meals prepared by Mira and watched the sunset over the ocean that had carried them to safety. It should have been idyllic, but peace for people who'd survived what they'd survived felt like waiting for punishment to arrive. They both jumped at unexpected sounds. Both woke from nightmares where the siege was still happening and the tunnels had collapsed and they'd died in darkness after all. Both carried the weight of survivors' guilt that came from being alive when so many others weren't. One evening, after Aeron had finally fallen asleep and Mira had retired to her own small room, Seris and Vaeren sat on the cottage porch watching stars emerge against the darkening sky. Varen's wounds had healed enough that he could move without visible pain, though Seris caught him touching his ribs sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. "Which part?" "Any of it. All of it. The choices that brought us here." Vaeren was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent weeks thinking about nothing else. "I regret the people who died, the soldiers who followed me into a battle they couldn't win, the civilians caught in the siege, every life that ended because I chose principle over compromise." He looked at her. "But I don't regret the choice itself, because the alternative was proving that empires built on fear are unbreakable, that individuals don't matter when measured against collective stability, that love is a luxury rulers can't afford. And you think we proved otherwise? I think we proved it's possible to choose differently. Whether that was enough, whether it changes anything beyond our own lives, I don't know." Varen's expression shifted. "Most revolutions fail. Most people who stand against inherited power get crushed. But someone has to try. Someone has to prove that the system isn't inevitable, even if proving it costs everything. Especially then." Seris reached for his hand. "You know we can never go back, I know. We can never reclaim what we lost. The crowns, the power, the empires we were born into. I know. We're just people now. Refugees hiding in a fishing village, living on borrowed time and borrowed money, hoping nobody recognizes us." Vaeren smiled. "Just people. That's the most freedom I've ever had. You're insane." "Probably." He pulled her closer. "But I'd rather be insane and honest than sane and hollow." The past caught up with them on a morning that started like any other. Seris was feeding Aeron, marveling at how much he'd grown in 6 weeks, when Mira appeared in the doorway with an expression that made Seris's stomach drop. "There are soldiers in the village," Mira said quietly, "asking questions, showing sketches." "Imperial soldiers?" "No. House Vaelor colors." The words landed like stones into still water. Seris felt her pulse spike. "How many?" "6. Maybe 8. Enough to be a threat if they find us." She stood carefully, passing Aeron to Mira. "Where's Vaeren?" "Still sleeping." The physician said, "Wake him. We need to leave, now." Seris moved to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. Down the village's main path she could see them. Soldiers in the black and silver of House Vaelor, going door to door with the methodical efficiency of people executing a search pattern. They'd found her, somehow, despite Malrek's promise that they were dead. Despite 6 weeks of careful hiding, the Empire had reached out and found them. Vaeren appeared, moving stiffly but faster than he should have been capable of, given his injuries. His face when he saw the soldiers carried the resigned recognition of someone who'd always known this moment would come. "The boats," he said. Seris shook her head. "We sold them for food money 3 weeks ago. We have no transport. Then we run, on foot, into the hills. You're barely healed. You won't make it a mile. Then I make it as far as I can and you keep going. The old argument. The one they'd been having in various forms since the moment this started. Who sacrificed for whom? Who survived at whose expense? Vaeren gripped her shoulders. Listen to me. If they take us, Malrek's protection ends. We stand trial, public execution. They'll use Aeron as an example of what happens when bloodlines mix without sanction. I know. So you take our son and you run. Mira will help you. I'll buy you time. By doing what? Fighting 8 soldiers alone? If necessary, that's not buying time. That's suicide. Varen's expression went hard. Then it's suicide that gives you a chance. That's all I have left to offer. Seris stared at the man who'd destroyed his kingdom for her and was now preparing to destroy himself. And she made a choice that felt like tearing out her own heart. No. The word dropped between them like a blade. Varen's eyes widened. What? No, you don't get to martyr yourself so I can run. We survive together or we fall together, but I'm done watching you sacrifice pieces of yourself. Seris, that's not... It's exactly rational. It's honest. You taught me that. You showed me that choosing truth over survival is the only thing that makes survival worth having. She pulled him close. So we face this together. No more running, no more martyrdom. We tell them the truth and we live with whatever consequences come. That's insane. You told me insanity was just honesty the Empire couldn't control. Vaeren stared at her. Then, slowly, something shifted in his expression. Not defeat. Understanding. You're sure? No. But I'm certain I'm tired of fear making my decisions. Vaeren pulled her into his arms, held her like she was the only solid thing in a world that wouldn't stop collapsing. Outside, the soldiers were getting closer. Mira stood holding Aeron, looking between them with an expression that carried disbelief and pride in equal measure. You're both insane, she said. Probably, Seris agreed. What do you want me to do? Stay with Aeron, keep him safe. If this goes badly, it won't. Varen's voice carried absolute conviction. It won't because we're going to walk out there and give them something they're not expecting. What? The truth. Unvarnished. Without apology or performance. He moved toward the door. Trust me. Seris followed. Because after everything, trust was the only thing left that mattered. Says, they walked into the village square together, Varen's hand in hers. No weapons, no armor, no performance of power. Just 2 people who'd chosen each other over empires, and were about to discover whether that choice had been brave or foolish. The soldiers saw them immediately. Weapons came out, shouts echoed across the square. Villagers scattered, disappearing into homes and shops with the practiced efficiency of people who'd learned not to get involved in other people's wars. Within seconds, they were surrounded. 8 soldiers in full battle armor, swords drawn, positioned in a circle that left no escape route. And standing at the center of the circle, wearing the formal robes of House Vaelor, was someone Seris hadn't expected to see. Lord Malrek himself. Her uncle looked older than he had 6 weeks ago. Thinner, like the weight of choices he'd made was consuming him from the inside. When he spoke, his voice carried exhaustion that went beyond physical. You couldn't just stay disappeared. We tried, Seris said quietly. But you found us anyway. Malrek's jaw tightened. I didn't send them to find you. I sent them to protect you. The words didn't make sense. Seris stared at her uncle. What? Malrek gestured to the soldiers. They're not here to arrest you. They're here because word reached me that House Corden had sent hunters to finish what the siege didn't. I couldn't let that happen. He looked at Vaeren. Despite everything, despite the empire you cost me, I couldn't let them kill you. Why? Because I've spent 6 weeks watching the empire I helped build fracture into civil war, watching houses tear each other apart over questions of succession and legitimacy, and who has the right to rule. Malrek's voice went quiet. And I realized that you were right. About all of it. The empire was built on fear. It only functioned as long as nobody questioned the foundation. But you questioned it. You proved it was possible to choose differently. So you came to kill us yourself? No. I came to offer you a choice. Malrek stepped closer. Come back. Both of you. Take your place as joint rulers of a reformed empire. Help me build something different. something that doesn't require constant sacrifice to maintain. The offer hung in the air. Impossible. Tempting. Terrifying. Seris felt Vaeren's hand tighten around hers. "What's the alternative?" Vaeren asked. "I let you go." Again. Permanently this time. I tell the hunters you died. I bury the rumors. You disappear into obscurity, and I spend the rest of my life trying to hold together an empire that's tearing itself apart. Malrek's expression twisted. But at least you'd be safe. At least I wouldn't have your deaths on my conscience alongside everyone else who died because I valued control over humanity. The soldiers around them shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the kind of conversation that usually happened between refugees and the powers hunting them. Seris looked at Vaeren, at the man who'd sacrificed his kingdom, saw in his eyes the same exhaustion she felt, the bone-deep tiredness that came from running, hiding, surviving on the edge of disaster. They could go back, reclaim power, try to rebuild something better from the ashes of what they'd destroyed, or they could refuse, choose the freedom they'd fought for, live as just people instead of symbols. Vaeren looked at Malrek. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd finally learned what mattered. "We can't come back." The words fell like judgments. Malrek's face crumpled. "Why not?" "Because the moment we do, we become what we were trying to escape. We become rulers again instead of people. And we'll spend the rest of our lives performing strength instead of actually living." Vaeren stepped forward. "You want to build something different? Then build it without us. Prove that empires can survive without being built on bloodline mythology and inherited power. Show them that legitimate governance comes from consent and competence, not from which family someone was born into. You're asking me to dismantle the entire system. I'm asking you to do what you've always been too afraid to do. Choose humanity over control." Malrek stared at his nephew, then at Seris. "And if I can't? If the empire collapses without legitimate succession, then maybe it deserves to collapse." Seris's voice was steady. Maybe the whole structure was rotten from the beginning. Maybe the only way to build something better is to let the old system burn completely. She met her uncle's eyes. "You want our blessing? You have it. Rule, reform, build whatever you can from the ashes, but do it without us." Malrek looked between them. These two people who'd cost him everything and somehow given him the only honest relationship he'd had in decades. "You're certain?" Vaeren nodded. "We're certain that we'd rather be poor and free than powerful and hollow." Malrek stood silent for a long moment. Then he turned to his soldiers. "Stand down. These people died in the siege. Understood?" The soldiers hesitated, then lowered their weapons. "Understood, my lord." Malrek looked back at Seris and Vaeren. "Then this is goodbye." "It is." Seris stepped forward, embraced her uncle for the first time since childhood, felt him shake against her. "Thank you," she whispered, "for letting us go." When she pulled back, Malrek's eyes were wet. "Be happy," he said roughly. "That's all I ask. Be happy enough that this wasn't for nothing." He turned and walked away. His soldiers followed. Within minutes, the square was empty except for Seris and Vaeren, standing in the morning sunlight, holding each other's hands, watching the Empire walk away and leave them in peace. Musqueam, 5 years later. The cottage Seris and Vaeren built with their own hands sat on a hillside overlooking the ocean. Small, simple, perfect. They grew their own food in gardens that Seris tended with the same careful attention she'd once given to political maneuvering. Vaeren worked as a carpenter in the nearby village, using skills he'd learned from necessity rather than training. They were poor. They were anonymous. They were happier than either had ever been while wearing crowns. Aaron grew into a bright, curious child who knew nothing of empires or bloodlines or the wars his parents had survived to give him this simple life. He knew the ocean. He knew the woods behind their cottage. He knew his parents loved him with a fierceness that had nothing to do with legacy or dynasty and everything to do with the miracle of his existence. One evening, Seris stood on the cottage porch watching the sun set while Vaeren and Aaron chased each other through the garden, laughing with the kind of uncomplicated joy that felt like freedom made audible. Mira appeared beside her, now more sister than servant, holding 2 cups of tea. Thinking about the past? Always. Regrets? Seris was quiet for a moment, then smiled. Not a single one. Mira nodded. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the man who'd been a king dig in the dirt with his son, while the world they'd escaped continued its slow transformation somewhere far away. News reached them sometimes. Travelers brought stories of reforms sweeping through the empire, of Malrek implementing changes that would have been unthinkable a decade ago, of bloodline requirements being questioned, of merit replacing birth as the measure of fitness to govern. It was slow, painful, incomplete, but it was happening. And somewhere in those distant halls of power, Seris liked to imagine that their defiance had planted seeds that were finally beginning to grow. But those were distant concerns. Here, in this moment, on this hillside, the only empire that mattered was the one they'd built together, small, human, real. Vaeren looked up from the garden, caught her watching, and smiled. The expression transformed his face from the serious, scarred man who still sometimes woke screaming from nightmares of siege and violence into someone who looked almost peaceful. "Come play," he called. Aeron echoed him. "Mama, come play." Seris set down her tea, walked down into the garden. Let her son grab her hand and pull her into whatever game they'd invented. Let Vaeren wrap his arms around her from behind while their child laughed and the sun painted the sky gold, and understood with absolute clarity that this was what they'd fought for. Not abstract principles or political philosophy or the reformation of empires. This. Moments where love wasn't a threat or a weapon or a scandal, just love. Simple, honest, enough. The world would remember them as the Alpha King who fell and the lady who destroyed him. History would argue about whether they were heroes or fools. Scholars would debate the impact of their choices for generations. But here, in this garden, in this moment, they were just people, living, loving, free. And that freedom, Seris realized, was the truest form of power they'd ever known. Not the power to command or control or bend others to their will, but the power to choose their own lives, to define their own worth, to prove that empires built on fear weren't inevitable, that love, despite everything arrayed against it, could survive, could thrive, could be enough. The sun set, the stars emerged, and in a small cottage on a hillside overlooking the sea, a family that had once been the center of empire sat down to a simple meal and found in that simplicity everything that crowns and thrones had never given them: peace, purpose, home. The empire they'd escaped would endure or collapse on its own terms. But this empire, the one they'd built from love and choice, and the stubborn refusal to let fear decide their worth, this empire was theirs. And it would last as long as they chose to defend it, not with armies or violence or the machinery of inherited power, but with the quiet daily choice to keep choosing each other, to keep building, to keep believing that some things were worth the cost of everything. That night, after Aeron had fallen asleep and the cottage was quiet, except for the sound of waves against distant rocks, Seris and Vaeren stood at the window looking out at the darkness. "Do you think we made the right choice?" Seris asked. Vaeren pulled her close. "I think we made the only choice that let us remain human. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know. But I know I'd rather die honest than live hollow." Seris leaned into him, felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the proof that they'd survived, that love, against all odds, had been stronger than fear. "I love you," she said. The words felt inadequate for everything they'd endured together, but they were true. And truth, they'd learned, was the most powerful weapon against empires built on lies. Vaeren kissed the top of her head. "I love you too. Always." Always felt like a promise they might actually keep, not because they were certain of the future, but because they'd learned that surviving the present was revolutionary enough. They stood together at the window while the world outside continued its endless transformation. And in that moment, they were not lady and king, not scandal and sacrifice, not symbols of anything except their own stubborn humanity. They were just Seris and Vaeren, two people who'd chosen love over fear, who'd survived the Empire's attempt to destroy them, who'd built something small and perfect from the ashes of everything they'd lost. And that, in the end, was the only legacy that mattered, not crowns or thrones or the reformation of political systems, but the quiet proof that some things, some people, were worth defending, even when defense cost everything, especially then. The story of the Alpha King who fell and the lady who destroyed him would be told for generations. But this story, the one where they survived and found peace and raised their son in freedom, this story was theirs alone, and it would endure as long as they chose to tell it, as long as they chose each other, as long as love remained stronger than fear, forever.